In a quiet village on the outskirts of Iowa, the Perkins family farm had stood for decades. Once a thriving center of rural life, it now stood as a faded shadow of its former glory. Long ago, this land had been the stage for a tragic event that would forever alter the course of local history. In the summer of 1964, a young woman named Fiona Perkins vanished under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind a shattered family and a town full of unanswered questions. Years passed, and the case faded into local legend. A whisper echoed in cafes and grocery stores. But the truth, as always, was buried deeper than anyone could have imagined. Now, 60 years later, Daniel Wright found himself inheriting this abandoned farm from an uncle he'd never met. Daniel was a man in his mid-40s, tall with dark brown hair that was starting to gray at the temples. He had recently gone through a divorce and was looking for a fresh start with his only son, Zach, a 15-year-old with a mop of unruly hair and a penchant for video games. When Daniel and Zach first arrived at the farm, it was in a state of disrepair. Weeds grew wild, fences were falling down, and the barn needed major repairs. But Daniel saw potential in this place. It was a chance for him and his son to build something together, to escape the bustle of city life and reconnect with each other and the land. Little did they know that their efforts to restore the farm would unearth secrets long buried, setting in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything they thought they knew about family, loyalty, and the weight of the past. It was a sweltering day in late August when everything changed. Daniel and Zach had been working for weeks to clear the overgrown fields and repair the crumbling infrastructure of the farm. They were making progress, slowly but surely bringing life back to the neglected property. "Dad, I think we should dig the new well here," Zach said, pointing to a spot near the old barn. The dowsing rods were really active in this area. Daniel chuckled, shaking his head at his son's enthusiasm for the old-fashioned method of water divination. "All right, Zach, we'll give it a shot. But if we don't hit water, we're calling in the professionals, deal?" Zach grinned, already grabbing the shovels from the back of their old pickup truck. "Deal." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, father and son fell into a rhythm, taking turns digging and clearing away the loosened earth. The work was hard, but there was a satisfaction in it, a feeling of accomplishment that had been missing from both their lives for too long. The shovel struck something hard, sending a jolt up Daniel's arms. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow with a muddy hand. They'd been digging for hours, and the well was supposed to be nothing but dirt for at least another 10 feet. He called down to Zach, who was working beside him in the hole. "Hey, grab the flashlight, will you? I think we hit something." Little did he know that metallic clang would be the sound that changed everything. Zach shone the flashlight where Daniel's shovel had struck. The beam reflected off something smooth and metallic, a stark contrast to the dark earth surrounding it. "What is that, Dad?" Zach asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Daniel shrugged, already scraping away more dirt with his hands. "I don't know, bud. Let's find out." As they dug, the object began to take shape. It was a metal container about the size of a small suitcase. It looked old, the once shiny surface now pitted and corroded. Daniel's mind raced with possibilities. A time capsule, buried treasure, or just some farmer's junk tossed in a hole and forgotten. It took another hour of careful digging to free the container from the earth. By the time they hauled it out of the well, the sun was setting. They carried their find back to the barn, both of them silent, lost in their own thoughts about what might be inside. Under the harsh glare of the barn's floodlights, Daniel examined the container more closely. It was sealed tight, with no obvious way to open it. A faded inscription was barely visible on one side, but years of corrosion had made it illegible. "Should we open it?" Zach asked, practically bouncing with excitement. Daniel hesitated. Part of him wanted to call the police or maybe a lawyer. What if this was evidence of something? But curiosity won out. "All right," he said, reaching for a crowbar. Stand back." It took some effort, but finally the lid creaked open. The smell hit them first, musty and damp, like an old cellar. Inside, protected by layers of waxy paper, was a stack of documents and photographs. Daniel picked up the first photo, holding it under the light. It showed a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, smiling at the camera. The picture was old, probably from the 1960s, judging by her hairstyle and clothes. He turned it over. On the back, in faded ink, was written, "Fiona Perkins, 1964. Zach peered over his shoulder. "Who's that, Dad?" Daniel shook his head. "I don't know." But as he said it, a nagging feeling started in the pit of his stomach. The name Perkins sounded familiar, but he couldn't place why. They spent the next hour going through the contents of the box. There were more photos, all of the same young woman, Fiona, at various locations around what looked like this very farm. There were also letters, newspaper clippings, and a small leather-bound journal. As Daniel flipped through the journal, a yellowed newspaper clipping fell out. The headline made his blood run cold. "Local woman still missing after 3 months." He read the article quickly, his heart pounding. Fiona Perkins had disappeared from her family's farm in the summer of 1964. Despite an extensive search, no trace of her was ever found. The article mentioned that Fiona's father, the owner of the farm, was the primary suspect, but was never charged due to lack of evidence. "Dad?" Zach's voice snapped Daniel back to the present. "What's wrong?" Daniel looked at his son, trying to keep his voice steady. "Zach, I think we just found evidence in a very old missing persons case." His eyes widened. "Really? Like a real mystery?" Daniel nodded, his mind racing. "Yeah, bud. A real mystery." He started gathering up the documents, careful not to disturb them more than necessary. "We need to call the police." The next few hours were a blur. Deputies came out to the farm, followed by detectives and a crime scene unit. Their quiet little farmhouse became the center of a whirlwind of activity. Daniel and Zach were questioned separately, telling and retelling how they'd found the box. It was past midnight when things finally calmed down. The box and its contents had been taken away as evidence, and they'd been told not to discuss the case with anyone, as if they knew anyone to discuss it with. They were still new in town, barely knew their neighbors. Daniel tucked Zach into bed, his head full of excitement about their discovery, but sleep eluded him. He sat at the kitchen table, a cold cup of coffee in front of him, staring out at the darkened fields. What had happened to Fiona Perkins, and why did her name sound so familiar? The next morning, Daniel drove into town, determined to do some digging of his own. The local library was small, but it had archives of the town's newspaper going back decades. He spent hours poring over microfiche, reading everything he could about the Perkins case. Fiona had been 23 when she disappeared, engaged to be married. Her fiancé, David Shields, had reported her missing when she didn't show up for a date. The last person to see her was her father, Warren Perkins, who claimed she'd left the farm to run errands in town. As Daniel read, pieces started falling into place. Warren Perkins. That was his uncle's name, the uncle who'd left him this farm. With a growing sense of dread, he realized why Fiona's name had sounded familiar. His mother had mentioned her once, years ago, a cousin who'd gone missing before he was born. Daniel left the library in a daze, his mind reeling. Had his uncle been involved in Fiona's disappearance? Had he inherited not just a farm, but a dark family secret? When he got home, there was a police car in the driveway. Detective Susan Cohen, the lead investigator, was waiting for him. "Mr. Wright," she said as he got out of his truck, "we need to talk." They sat at the kitchen table, the same one where Daniel had spent a sleepless night. Detective Cohen didn't waste time on pleasantries. "We've identified the DNA on some of the items in the box," she said, her eyes boring into his. "It matches Fiona Perkins. We're treating this as a homicide investigation now." Daniel nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Mr. Wright, I have to ask, did you know anything about this before you found that box? Daniel shook his head vehemently. No, absolutely not. I inherited this farm from my uncle 6 months ago. I never even met him. She raised an eyebrow. Your uncle? Daniel took a deep breath. Warren Perkins, Fiona's father. Detective Cohen leaned back, surprised. You're related to the Perkins family. Daniel explained what he'd learned at the library, about the connection he'd only just discovered. As he talked, he could see the wheels turning in the detective's mind. Mr. Wright, I'm going to be straight with you, she said when he finished. This complicates things. We're going to need to do a thorough search of the property, and I'm afraid you and your son might need to find somewhere else to stay for a while. Daniel nodded, feeling numb. Of course, whatever you need. The next few weeks were a nightmare. The farm became a crime scene, with police and forensic teams combing every inch of the property. Daniel and Zach moved into a motel in town, watching from afar as their new home was torn apart in search of evidence. The story hit the local news, then went national. Suddenly, their quiet little town was overrun with reporters and true crime enthusiasts. Everyone wanted to know about the mysterious box, about Fiona Perkins, about the farmer who'd inherited a decades-old secret. Daniel tried to shield Zach from the worst of it, but it was impossible to hide everything. Zach was old enough to understand the basics of what was happening, and his initial excitement about solving a mystery had given way to a more somber understanding of the reality they were facing. It was Zach who asked the question Daniel had been avoiding. Dad, do you think Uncle Warren did it? Do you think he killed Fiona? Daniel pulled him close, wishing he had a better answer. I don't know, buddy. I really don't know. As the investigation dragged on, more details emerged. Old case files were reopened, witnesses re-interviewed. The picture that emerged was a sad one. Fiona had wanted to leave the farm to start a life with her fiancé. Warren Perkins had opposed the marriage, wanting Fiona to stay and help run the family business. But there was no smoking gun, no confession, just a lot of circumstantial evidence and a family torn apart by secrets and suspicion. Finally, after nearly 2 months, they were allowed to return to the farm. The police had found no other evidence, and while the investigation remained open, they had no reason to keep Daniel and Zach from their home. The farm felt different now. Every creaking floorboard, every rustle in the field seemed to whisper of long-buried secrets. Daniel found himself avoiding the spot where they'd found the box, as if Fiona's ghost might be lingering there. But life, as it always does, went on. Daniel and Zach threw themselves back into the work of restoring the farm, finding solace in the rhythm of physical labor. They talked about Fiona sometimes, wondering about the life she might have led, the dreams she'd never gotten to fulfill. In a way, she'd become part of their family story now, a presence that lingered in the corners of their new home. As autumn turned to winter and the fields lay fallow under a blanket of snow, Daniel often found himself standing at the kitchen window, looking out over the land that had been in his family for generations. He thought about secrets, about the weight of the past, and about the bonds that tie us to the land and to each other. He didn't have all the answers, and maybe he never would. But he had his son, and they had this farm, and together they would write the next chapter of this place's long and complicated history. In the bustling port of Miami, where cruise ships tower like gleaming cities, the Sapphire Duchess prepared for her maiden voyage. Among the throng of excited passengers and busy crew members, one figure moved with purpose and quiet authority. This was Adrian Reeves, the ship's newly appointed head of security. Adrian was no stranger to the cruise industry. At 35, he had spent the better part of a decade working his way up through the ranks of various cruise lines. His career had been marked by professionalism and a keen eye for detail, but nothing in his years of experience could have prepared him for the events that would unfold on this fateful journey. As Adrian oversaw the final security checks before departure, he couldn't shake a sense of unease. Maybe it was the pressure of the maiden voyage, or perhaps it was something more intangible. Whatever it was, he pushed it aside, focusing on the task at hand. The Sapphire Duchess was a marvel of modern engineering. 15 decks high, with a capacity for over 4,000 passengers and 1,500 crew members, she was a floating resort complete with multiple swimming pools, a theater, countless restaurants, and even a miniature golf course. But for Adrian, the most impressive feature was the state-of-the-art security system. High-definition cameras covered every public area, with facial recognition software capable of tracking individual passengers throughout the ship. Electronic key cards monitored access to all areas, and a team of highly trained security personnel was always on alert. It was a system designed to ensure the safety of everyone on board, or so they thought. As the ship pulled away from the port, Adrian made his way to the bridge to meet with Captain Helena Vaughn. Helena was a veteran of the seas, with over 2 decades of experience commanding cruise ships. She greeted Adrian with a firm handshake and a warm smile. "Mr. Reeves, welcome aboard. I trust everything is in order with security?" Adrian nodded. "Yes, Captain. All systems are operational, and my team is ready for anything." Helena's smile widened. "Excellent. Let's hope for a smooth and uneventful journey." Little did they know, fate had other plans. The first few days of the cruise passed without incident. Passengers lounged by the pools, enjoyed lavish meals, and took in the nightly entertainment. Adrian and his team maintained a vigilant watch, dealing with the usual minor issues: lost key cards, noise complaints, and the occasional overindulgent guest. It was on the 4th night of the cruise that Adrian met Sophia Kensington. He was making his nightly rounds when he noticed her sitting alone at the ship's aft bar, long after most passengers had retired for the evening. Something about her caught his attention. Maybe it was the way she nursed her drink, lost in thought, or the subtle air of melancholy that seemed to surround her. Adrian approached, more out of concern than suspicion. "Excuse me, miss. Is everything all right?" Sophia looked up, startled out of her reverie. Her eyes, a striking shade of green, met Adrian's. "Oh yes, I'm fine, thank you. Just enjoying the night air." Adrian nodded but didn't move away. "I'm Adrian Reeves, head of ship security. If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to ask." A small smile touched Sophia's lips. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Reeves. I'm Sophia Kensington. And truly, I'm fine. Just a bit of trouble sleeping." They fell into an easy conversation. Adrian learned that Sophia was a writer, on the cruise to find inspiration for her next novel. She was witty and charming, with a laugh that seemed to brighten the night. By the time Adrian continued his rounds, he found himself looking forward to seeing her again. Over the next few days, Adrian and Sophia's paths crossed frequently. They shared meals in the crew mess, Sophia having been granted special access due to her status as a travel writer. They watched sunsets from the upper deck, talking about everything and nothing. Adrian found himself drawn to her in a way he hadn't experienced before. But even as he grew closer to Sophia, Adrian couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Small inconsistencies in her stories, moments when her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. He told himself he was being paranoid, that his professional suspicion was bleeding into his personal life. Still, the nagging doubt remained. It was on the 7th night of the cruise that everything changed. Adrian was in the security office, reviewing footage from the previous day, when an alert came through. A passenger had reported their cabin safe broken into, valuable jewelry missing. As Adrian and his team began their investigation, more reports flooded in. 5 cabins, then 10, then 20, all robbed, all within the same 2-hour window. Adrian's mind raced. This was no opportunistic thief. This was a coordinated operation, one that had managed to bypass their supposedly impenetrable security system. As he coordinated with the ship's management and prepared to contact the authorities at their next port of call, a chilling thought struck him. He pulled up the passenger manifest, scrolling frantically until he found the name he was looking for: Sophia Kensington. But when he tried to access her details, an error message flashed on the screen. No such passenger found. With a growing sense of dread, Adrian expanded his search. He combed through hours of security footage, focusing on the areas where he had interacted with Sophia. But she was nowhere to be seen. It was as if she had never existed. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had been played. Sophia, or whoever she really was, had used him, gotten close to him to learn about the ship's security measures, to find the gaps in their system, and he had let it happen. As the ship descended into chaos, with panicked passengers demanding answers and the crew scrambling to maintain order, Adrian found himself at the center of a storm. He had to find Sophia, had to understand how this had happened. But even as he launched a ship-wide search, he knew it was probably too late. Sophia Kensington, the woman he had begun to fall for, was gone. And with her, millions of dollars in stolen jewelry and the shattered illusion of the Sapphire Duchess's perfect security. The following days were a blur of investigations, interrogations, and damage control. The cruise line's reputation took a massive hit, and Adrian found his career hanging by a thread. But more than that, he was haunted by the memory of Sophia's laugh, the touch of her hand, the conversations they had shared. Had any of it been real? As the Sapphire Duchess limped back to port, its maiden voyage cut short by scandal, Adrian stood at the railing, watching the shoreline grow closer. He had failed in his duty, been fooled by a clever con artist. But as the sea breeze whipped around him, he made a silent vow. He would find Sophia, or whatever her real name was. He would uncover the truth behind the heist that had shaken the cruise industry to its core. Little did Adrian know, his pursuit of the truth would lead him down a dangerous path, a path that would uncover a web of international crime, corrupt officials, and deadly secrets. The mystery of Sophia Kensington was just the beginning. As the years passed, Adrian's search for Sophia became an obsession. He left the cruise industry, using his skills and contacts to become a private investigator specializing in maritime crime. Every lead, every whisper of a jewelry heist or a con artist matching Sophia's description sent him racing across the globe. His journey took him from the glittering casinos of Monte Carlo to the bustling ports of Singapore, from the sun-drenched beaches of the Caribbean to the foggy docks of London. Along the way, he uncovered a vast criminal network that specialized in targeting luxury cruise ships, using sophisticated techniques to bypass security and relieve wealthy passengers of their valuables. But Sophia remained elusive, always one step ahead. Adrian's obsession cost him relationships, alienated friends, and more than once nearly cost him his life. Yet he couldn't let go. The memory of those nights on the Sapphire Duchess, the warmth of Sophia's smile, the sparkle in her green eyes, it drove him forward, even as part of him wondered if he was chasing a ghost. It was 5 years after the Sapphire Duchess heist that Adrian finally got his break. A tip from an informant led him to a small, exclusive resort on a private island in the Maldives. As he watched from a distance, he saw her, Sophia, or whatever her real name was, lounging by a pool, sipping a cocktail as if she didn't have a care in the world. Adrian's heart raced. After all this time, all the dead ends and false leads, she was right there. He had a choice to make: alert the authorities, bring her in to face justice for her crimes, or confront her himself, finally get the answers he had been seeking for so long. In the end, the decision was easy. Adrian approached the pool, his eyes locked on Sophia. She saw him coming, and for a moment, surprise flashed across her face. Then slowly she smiled. It was the same smile that had captivated him years ago on the Sapphire Duchess. "Hello, Adrian," she said, her voice as smooth and intoxicating as he remembered. "I was wondering when you'd find me." In the vast expanse of the American Southwest, where the desert stretches endlessly under an indifferent sky, strange tales are born. They whisper through truck stops, flutter in the neon glow of all-night diners, and echo in the cab of long-haul trucks. I never thought I'd become part of one of those tales. My name's Russell, and for the past 20 years, I've been crisscrossing this country behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler. I've seen my share of oddities out on the road. Inexplicable lights in the sky, phantom hitchhikers that vanish in the rearview mirror, and weather that defies explanation. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what happened on that moonless night in the heart of Nevada. It was supposed to be a routine job. A straight shot from Phoenix to Seattle. My trailer loaded with electronics bound for the tech giants of the Pacific Northwest. The cab of my truck was my second home, the hum of tires on asphalt a lullaby I knew by heart. As I cruised through the desert night, the radio kept me company, a mix of classic rock, late-night talk shows about conspiracy theories, and the occasional trucker sharing a spooky tale over the CB. The clock on my dashboard read just past midnight when I first saw him, a lone figure standing on the shoulder of the highway, thumb extended in the universal sign of the hitchhiker. Now, I'm not usually one for picking up strangers. Too many horror stories, too many risks in this day and age. But something about this guy made me ease off the accelerator. Maybe it was the lost look in his eyes, visible even from a distance in my headlights. Or maybe it was the way he hugged himself against the chill desert wind, looking small and vulnerable against the vast, star-studded sky. Whatever it was, I found myself pulling over, the air brakes hissing as I brought the big rig to a stop. "Where you headed?" I called out as he approached, his features coming into sharper focus. "Anywhere but here," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper, nearly lost in the ambient noise of the idling engine. I should have listened to the warning bells going off in my head, should have wished him well and gotten back on the road. Instead, I heard myself saying, "Hop in. I'm going to Seattle if that works for you." He climbed into the passenger seat, bringing with him the smell of dust and something else, something I couldn't quite place. Up close, he looked young, maybe mid-20s, with shaggy brown hair and eyes that seemed to dart nervously around the cab. "I'm Russell," I said, pulling back onto the highway, the big rig's engine rumbling as we picked up speed. "Liam," he replied, not meeting my gaze. "Thanks for the ride." We drove in silence for a while, the only sound the rumble of the engine and the whisper of tires on asphalt. I tried to make conversation a few times, asking where he was from, what brought him out to the middle of nowhere. But Liam's responses were monosyllabic at best, his attention seemingly focused on something far beyond the windshield. Eventually, I gave up, focusing on the road ahead. The miles ticked by, marked only by the occasional lonely gas station or the brief flare of passing headlights. It was about an hour later when I noticed Liam had fallen asleep, his head lolling against the window. I turned the radio down a notch, not wanting to disturb him. That's when things started to get weird. It began with a twitch, just a small movement of his hand. Then his breathing changed, becoming rapid and shallow. His eyes started moving frantically behind closed lids, like he was in the depths of some intense dream. I was just about to wake him, worried he might be having some kind of fit, when he started muttering. At first it was too low to make out, but it quickly grew louder. No, please, don't let it find me." A chill ran down my spine. His voice was filled with pure, unadulterated fear. "Hey, buddy," I said, reaching out to shake his shoulder. "Wake up. You're having a nightmare." But he didn't wake. Instead, his muttering grew more frantic, his body starting to thrash in the seat. "It's coming. Oh, God, it's coming. Can't you see it? Can't you see its eyes?" And that's when he let out that scream, the one that made me nearly drive off the road. It wasn't human. It couldn't have been. No person could make a sound like that. Raw, primal, and filled with a terror so deep it made my blood run cold. His eyes flew open, wild and unfocused, reflecting the green glow of the dashboard like some nocturnal animal. I managed to pull over, my heart pounding in my chest. Liam, snap out of it!" He turned to look at me, but his eyes seemed to be seeing something else, something beyond me. "It followed me," he whispered, his voice hoarse from screaming. "Oh God, Russell, it followed me into the truck." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "What followed you?" "Liam, there's nothing here but us." He shook his head violently. "You can't see it, but it's here. It's always here." His eyes darted around the cab, following something invisible. "We have to get out, now!" Before I could stop him, he'd thrown open the passenger door and leapt out into the night. I cursed, fumbling with my seatbelt before following him. The desert night was cold and still, the only sound the tick of the cooling engine and Liam's ragged breathing. He stood a few feet from the truck, arms wrapped around himself, shaking like a leaf. "Liam," I said, approaching him slowly like you would a spooked animal. "What's going on? What do you think is following you?" He turned to me, his face pale in the truck's headlights. "I don't know what it is, but it's been after me for days. Ever since I found that thing in the desert." "What thing?" I asked, a sick feeling growing in my gut. Liam reached into his pocket with a shaking hand, pulling out what looked like a small stone. But as he held it up, I realized it wasn't a stone at all. It was some kind of artifact, carved with intricate symbols I'd never seen before. In the harsh glare of the headlights, it seemed to shimmer and shift, as if the symbols were moving. "I found this out there," Liam said, gesturing vaguely at the dark expanse of desert around us. "In some kind of old ruin. I thought it might be worth something." He laughed bitterly. I didn't know it would wake it up." "Wake what up?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Liam's eyes met mine, filled with a terror that made my blood run cold. "The thing that lives in the spaces between, the thing that hunts in dreams, it wants this back." He held up the artifact. "And it wants me for taking it." I wanted to tell him he was crazy, that he just had a nightmare, that there was no monster hunting him. But the conviction in his voice, the raw fear in his eyes, it was impossible to dismiss. "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Okay, so why don't we just give it back? Throw that thing away and be done with it." Liam shook his head frantically. "I've tried. It doesn't work like that. It's like it's attached to me now. The only way to get rid of it is to pass it on to someone else. To make them take it." A chill ran down my spine as I realized what he was saying. "That's why you were hitchhiking. You were trying to give it to someone else." He nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't want to, but I can't take it anymore. The dreams, the visions. It's driving me insane." I took a step back, suddenly very aware of how isolated we were out here in the desert night. "Liam, I can't. I won't take that thing." "Please," he begged, holding out the artifact. "Please, I can't do this anymore. Just take it. You'll see. You'll understand." For a moment I was tempted. The artifact seemed to call to me, the symbols swirling in a mesmerizing dance. But then I shook my head, snapping out of it. "No," I said firmly. "I won't do it, Liam. But I'll help you. We'll figure this out together, okay? There's got to be a way to get rid of that thing without passing it on." Liam stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he nodded. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay, we'll try." We got back in the truck, the artifact safely wrapped in a cloth and stowed in the glove compartment. As we pulled back onto the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The night seemed darker, the shadows deeper, and more than once I could have sworn I saw something moving just at the edge of my headlights. Something tall and thin with too many limbs. I don't know what happened to Liam after I dropped him off in Reno. He said he was going to find an expert, someone who could help him get rid of the artifact for good. I gave him my number, made him promise to call and let me know he was okay. It's been 3 months and I haven't heard from him. Sometimes on long night drives through the desert, I find myself scanning the side of the road, half expecting to see him standing there, thumb out. And sometimes in the moments between sleeping and waking, I see shapes in the shadows of my room, tall, twisted shapes with too many eyes. I tell myself it's just my imagination, just the lingering effects of that strange night. But deep down, I know the truth. Whatever was hunting Liam that night, whatever lived in his dreams, it's out there still, waiting, watching. And sometimes, when the night is darkest and the road stretches endlessly before me, I can't shake the feeling that it's watching me too. Because out here, in the vast emptiness of the American desert, where reality seems to bend and warp like a mirage on the horizon, anything is possible. And the line between nightmare and reality is as thin and fragile as a thread of spider silk in the moonlight. I keep driving, keep moving, hoping that the roar of my engine and the endless miles of asphalt will keep the shadows at bay. But in the quietest moments of the night, when the world seems to hold its breath, I wonder, how long can I outrun the darkness? And what will happen when it finally catches up? In the sweltering summer of 2006, I found myself behind the wheel of a flatbed truck, hauling a load of construction materials through the heart of rural Tennessee. The exact location escapes me now, lost in the fog of memory. But I reckon it was somewhere between Memphis and Nashville, inching closer to that nebulous intersection where Tennessee meets Mississippi and Alabama. It was the kind of place where the trees outnumbered the people, and the roads twisted through the landscape like veins in an aging hand. My cargo was a mishmash of house-building essentials: drywall sheets stacked like oversized playing cards, bundles of roofing shingles that smelled of tar and potential, and more prepackaged flooring than I'd ever seen in one place. It was a Tetris game of epic proportions, and I'd used every tie-down strap in my arsenal to keep it from sliding off the back of my truck. The load was so precarious that I'd spent an extra hour at the shipper's yard, meticulously tarping everything down. Or so I thought. About 5 miles down the road, deep in the bowels of nowhere, on a 2-lane blacktop that seemed to stretch into eternity, I noticed my tarp flapping in the wind like a distress signal. "Shit," I muttered, scanning the roadside for a place to pull over. Fortune smiled on me, and I found a wide shoulder that could accommodate my rig without risking life and limb. As I climbed out of the cab, the humid air hit me like a wet blanket. The woods pressed in close on both sides of the road, their green canopy blocking out most of the sky. It was the kind of place where you half expected to see eyes glowing in the underbrush, watching your every move. I shook off the thought and got to work. It didn't take long to realize that my initial tarping job was subpar at best. Cursing my earlier haste, I decided to redo the whole thing right there on the side of the road. I undid all the bungee straps, their elastic snapping back with enough force to leave welts on my arms. I dragged the tarps off, rolled them back up, and started the process anew. As I was unrolling the first tarp across the load, movement caught my eye. A lone figure was walking down the road towards my truck. Even from a distance, I could tell this guy was down on his luck. He moved with a shuffling gait, empty-handed and clearly unkempt. As he drew closer, I could make out a far-off stare in his eyes, like he was looking through the world rather than at it. I took stock of my surroundings, remembering that I was a good 10 to 20 miles deep into public forest land. There weren't any houses or cabins out here, just miles of green solitude punctuated by the occasional logging road or hiking trail. Sure, there could be day hikers or campers around, but something about this guy's presence felt off. He was alone on a road where even cars were a rarity. I tried to push my unease aside and focus on the task at hand. The tarps needed securing, and I couldn't let one strange wanderer distract me from my job. Still, I kept one eye on him as I worked, watching his slow but steady approach. By the time I had the tarps back in place and was climbing down to start hooking the bungee straps, the man had drawn close enough that I could no longer ignore his presence. As a precaution, I grabbed my winch bar and set it on the trailer where I was working. It was an 8-pound solid metal bar, about 4 feet long, with one end tapered to a blunt point and the other sporting a hollow opening. Officially, it was for tightening straps and chains. Unofficially, it was a damn good deterrent for any trouble that might come knocking. As the man finally reached me, the first thing that struck me was his hair. It was a mullet gone wrong, patchy and uneven, like he'd tried to cut it himself while riding a mechanical bull. Business in the front, party in the back, had never looked so apocalyptic. But it was his eyes that really got to me. They were clear, not glazed over like you'd expect from someone drunk or high. No, it was something else entirely. It was as if the lights were on, but nobody was home. The vacancy in his gaze sent a chill down my spine despite the summer heat. His clothes were a testament to hard times, threadbare, dirty, hanging off his gaunt frame like they belonged to someone else. His shoes were cheap white tennis sneakers, caked with mud and misery. One shoe was missing its laces entirely, the tongue lolling out like a dead man's. He stopped a few feet away from me and waited until I acknowledged him. When I did, he spoke in a voice that sounded like gravel being crushed underfoot. "I got a long walk." I nodded, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Yeah, man, you do. We're in the middle of nowhere." I made it clear with my tone that there was no ride to be had here. He seemed to accept this, nodding slowly before shuffling past me. But he only made it as far as the driver's door of my truck before stopping, turning around, and coming back. He repeated himself, "I've got a long walk." At this point, I felt a mix of pity and frustration. I explained as kindly as I could that I couldn't give him a ride. I mentioned insurance, company policy, anything I could think of to soften the rejection. I apologized for not being able to help more, hoping he'd take the hint and move on. He seemed to accept this second refusal, turning around and continuing down the road. I waited until he was a good distance away before returning to my work, but I kept one eye on his retreating figure as I finished securing the load. As I was putting the last of the bungee straps in place, I looked up to check on the stranger's progress. What I saw made my blood run cold. He had turned around and was heading back towards me at a rapid pace. Even more unsettling, it looked like he was talking on a cell phone. His hand was up to his face, and I could just make out his mouth moving, his other hand gesticulating wildly as if he was deep in conversation. I finished the straps in record time, grabbed my winch bar, and hopped down from the truck. I looked up just in time to see the man about 10 feet away, much closer than I'd expected. The sudden proximity startled me, and I blurted out, "Jesus, man, you scared me to death." He just smiled and nodded, lowering his phone hand and giving me his full attention. There was something predatory in his gaze now, a hunger that hadn't been there before. I started to speak. "Look, man, I can't—" He cut me off. "I know. Shut up." He chuckled, a sound devoid of any real humor. "The hell did you just say to me?" I growled, my grip tightening on the winch bar. He didn't respond, just took a few confident steps forward. I matched his advance, bringing the winch bar up before me like a medieval knight wielding a sword. He didn't even glance at it, taking one more step forward. Then, without warning, he blew a handful of sand directly into my eyes. The pain was immediate and intense. I was instantly blinded, nearly dropping to my knees from the shock. Through the burning agony, I could hear his shoes scuffling in the dirt around me, circling like a shark that had scented blood in the water. Panic surged through me, and I swung the winch bar wildly, hoping to connect with something, anything. But my desperate swings met only air. His footsteps receded slightly, and then a horrible realization dawned on me. He was going for my truck. I fumbled for the key fob in my pocket, my fingers feeling thick and clumsy. Finally, I managed to hit the lock button, hearing the satisfying click of the locks engaging. "Damn it," I heard him curse. "I was hoping you left those in the ignition." There was a pause, and then his voice took on a more menacing tone. "Well, I guess now I have to take them from you." I frantically tried to clear my eyes, but it was useless. The sand was caked in there good, and I knew I'd need water or eye drops to restore my vision fully. I could see a little out of my right eye, a blurry, tear-streaked view of the world, and I did my best to keep track of my attacker as he stalked around me. He made several lunges for my pocket, his hands roughly patting me down, searching for the keys. I managed to push him off twice, but I could feel his fingers probing, getting closer to their prize with each attempt. On his third try, I swung the winch bar with all my might, feeling it connect solidly with his shoulder. He grunted in pain and stumbled back a few steps. Taking advantage of the momentary reprieve, I backed up towards my trailer, hoping to use it as cover. But in that instant, my vision blurred again, and I lost sight of him. The world went silent. I couldn't hear his breathing, his footsteps, nothing. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I rubbed at my eyes furiously, trying to clear them enough to spot any movement. Suddenly I felt the trailer shift beneath my hands. With a jolt of terror, I realized he had climbed up onto it. He was going to come at me from above. Just as I started to step forward, I felt his arms snake around my throat from behind. If I hadn't felt the trailer move, he would have had me dead to rights. As it was, I managed to duck and shrug him off, using his own momentum to throw him off balance. In that moment of confusion, I made a break for it. I bolted for the truck, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I yanked the door open, hurled myself inside, and slammed it shut behind me, immediately hitting the lock button again for good measure. Safe inside the cab, I set the winch bar on the passenger seat and tried to get my bearings. My eyes were still burning, vision blurry, but I scanned the area for any sign of my attacker. What I saw next was perhaps the most unsettling thing of all. The man was standing about 10 feet from the truck, talking into his hand again. But this time he wasn't just talking, he was screaming, his face contorted with rage, spittle flying from his lips as he ranted at his imaginary phone. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I cranked the engine, threw it into gear, and pulled out onto the road without even checking for traffic. As I passed him, our eyes met for a brief moment. The look on his face was one of pure, unhinged malevolence, his eyes boring into me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I kept my foot heavy on the accelerator until I hit 5th, then 6th gear. When I finally dared to check my rearview mirror, he was gone, as if he'd never existed at all. A mile or so down the road, I found a safe place to pull over and properly clean out my eyes. By the time I was done, my vision had mostly cleared, but there was still no sign of the strange, violent man who had attacked me. To this day, that encounter remains the most terrifying experience of my life. I reported it to the police and my employers, of course, but nothing ever came of it. Sometimes, on long hauls through isolated stretches of country, I find myself scanning the roadsides, half expecting to see that crazed figure shambling towards me. I often wonder about that man, about what drove him to such desperation and madness. Was he truly insane, or just a predator who had found the perfect hunting ground in those lonely forests? And what would have happened if I hadn't been able to get away? But mostly, I think about how quickly an ordinary day can turn into a nightmare, how thin the line is between safety and mortal danger. That experience changed me, made me more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. It taught me that sometimes the most dangerous things aren't the wild animals or the treacherous roads, but the people we encounter in the most unexpected places. I still drive that same route sometimes, and every time I pass that stretch of road, I feel a chill run down my spine. I can't help but wonder if he's still out there, walking that long road to nowhere, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler to stop and offer help. In my darkest moments, I find myself hoping that guy got run over on his long walk to nowhere. It's not a kind thought, I know, but neither was he. And in this line of work, in those remote places where civilization feels like a distant memory, sometimes unkind thoughts are all that stand between you and the darkness that lurks just beyond the reach of your headlights. I should have known better. That's what I keep telling myself now, in the dark hours when sleep won't come. But how could I have known? Sometimes I think the whole universe conspired to put me in that bathroom that night, to make me witness something that shouldn't exist in our world. It started innocently enough. My best friend Rachel texted me on a Thursday afternoon. "Family camping trip this weekend. Mom says you can come. Please say yes." I still have that text saved. Sometimes I stare at it, wondering how different my life would be if I'd made up some excuse, if I'd stayed home that weekend. But I didn't, because Rachel added one crucial detail. Matt's coming too. Matt, Rachel's older brother. 6 feet of quiet intensity and thoughtful green eyes that made my heart skip every time he looked my way. I'd been nursing a crush on him since freshman year, when he'd helped me with calculus homework. Now, as a senior, he was even more impossible to ignore. "Obviously, yes," I texted back, already imagining cozy campfire conversations and maybe, just maybe, a moment alone with Matt under the stars. Mom was surprised when I volunteered to go camping. I'd always been more of an indoor girl, more comfortable with books and Netflix than hiking and mosquitoes. But she helped me pack, lending me her old sleeping bag and a flashlight that had seen better days. "Take my jacket too," she insisted, holding out her thick winter coat. "September nights get cold in the mountains." I declined, showing her the cute oversized sweater I'd picked out. "I'll be fine, Mom. We're not going to the Arctic." Another decision I'd regret. The Mitchells picked me up Friday afternoon in their weathered Suburban. Rachel's parents up front, Rachel in the middle row with me, and Matt in the back with the camping gear. I tried not to be too obvious about watching him in the rearview mirror, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead as he read something on his phone. The drive took us north into the mountains, leaving our small town behind. Rachel chatted excitedly about her plans for s'mores and ghost stories, but I was distracted by the changing landscape. The trees seemed to press closer to the road as we climbed, their shadows deepening despite the afternoon sun. Pinewood Campground was popular. Rachel's dad had to reserve spots months in advance, but something about it felt off from the moment we arrived. The sun was setting, painting the sky in bruised purples and sickly oranges. The trees here were old, their branches twisting together overhead to form dark archways. Other campers were scattered throughout the grounds, but they seemed oddly distant. They'd wave when we passed, but their smiles didn't quite reach their eyes. Their voices carried strangely in the cooling air, conversations becoming distorted and unintelligible. We set up camp in a clearing that felt exposed, despite being surrounded by trees. 3 tents, one for Rachel's parents, one for storage, and one for us 3 teenagers. Under normal circumstances, sharing a tent with Matt would have been the highlight of my weekend. Now, looking back, I wonder if that arrangement wasn't somehow deliberate, if something wanted us together that night. The temperature dropped rapidly after sunset. Rachel's mom made hot chocolate, but even clutching the warm mug, I couldn't stop shivering. I'd stubbornly stuck to my cute camping outfit, ripped jeans and that oversized sweater that now seemed pathetically inadequate. "Cold?" Matt asked, noticing my trembling hands. He offered me his jacket, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. The jacket smelled like him, pine needles and that subtle cologne he wore. Our fingers brushed as he helped me put it on, and I swear I felt electricity. But then I saw something move in the darkness beyond our campfire's light. Just a quick shadow, there and gone, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too fluid in its movement. "Did you see that?" I asked. Matt followed my gaze. "Probably just a deer. They get pretty bold around campsites." But his voice held a note of uncertainty that made my skin crawl. The bathroom situation was the first real red flag. Rachel's dad explained it was a 15-minute walk each way, following a path marked by blue reflectors. "Always go with a buddy," he insisted, even during the day. Looking at that path disappearing into the darkness, I understood why. The trees seemed to lean over it, creating a tunnel that swallowed light. The blue reflectors glowed too brightly, like eyes watching us from the shadows. I woke at 1:17 a.m. according to my phone's harsh glare. My bladder was painfully full, and the temperature inside the tent had dropped to a bone-chilling 24 degrees. Rachel was curled up in her sleeping bag, practically cocooned in layers of blankets. Matt was breathing deeply on the other side, one arm thrown over his face. The thought of waking them felt impossible. Rachel had finally gotten warm, and Matt, well, the idea of admitting to my crush that I needed a bathroom escort was mortifying. I could handle a short walk. I was 17, not 7. I wrapped Rachel's fuzzy blanket around my shoulders, slipped on my shoes, and grabbed the lantern. The tent zipper sounded impossibly loud in the midnight quiet. Outside, my breath clouded in the frigid air. The path to the bathroom seemed different at night. The blue reflectors cast an eerie glow that made the forest look underwater, distorted and alien. My lantern light caught strange shapes in the trees. Branches that looked like reaching hands, shadows that didn't quite match what cast them. The first twig snap came from my left, sharp as a gunshot in the silence. I swung my lantern toward the sound, but the light seemed to bend around whatever was there, leaving only darkness. My heart started to pound, but I told myself it was just wildlife. Bears, maybe, though that thought wasn't comforting. The footsteps behind me started so subtly I almost missed them. Just a soft crunch of leaves, perfectly timed to my own steps. When I stopped, they stopped. When I moved, they moved, always maintaining the same distance. I broke into a run, abandoning all pretense of bravery. The thing behind me ran too, its movements unlike anything I'd ever heard, too fluid, too rhythmic, like it had too many legs moving in perfect synchronization. The bathroom building appeared ahead, its fluorescent lights humming in the darkness. I crashed through the door, slamming it behind me and engaging the old metal lock. My reflection in the mirror showed a terrified girl with wind-burned cheeks and wild eyes. That's when I saw the foot. It wasn't a human foot. It couldn't be. Too long, too pale, like something that had never seen sunlight. The toes were wrong. Too many joints, too much flexibility as they gripped the dirty tile floor. The toenails were black with dirt or decay, and the skin was mapped with cuts that leaked something darker than blood. "What are you doing in the woods at this time?" The voice was female, but wrong, like someone reading from a script in a language they didn't quite understand. The words came out with odd emphases, consonants too sharp and vowels too long. I couldn't speak. My throat had closed up, survival instinct shutting down everything but the most essential functions. Run, hide, survive. "Let us play a game, Shannon. My name, my actual name, which I hadn't told anyone at the campground." The foot took a step forward, and I heard something wet sliding against the stall door. "Would you rather die in the woods or die right here?" The stall door clicked open. What emerged wasn't human. It had a woman's shape, but all wrong, limbs too long, joints bending in impossible directions. Its skin was the color of mushrooms that grow in the dark, and its face was mine. A perfect copy, but with eyes that glowed that same sickly blue as the path reflectors. I ran. Somewhere in the rational part of my mind, I knew running barefoot through a forest at night was suicide, but that part wasn't in control anymore. Pure animal instinct drove me forward, branches whipping my face and thorns tearing at my feet. The thing followed, its laughter echoing from multiple directions at once. Sometimes it seemed to come from ahead of me, sometimes behind, sometimes from the canopy above. The trees themselves seemed to reach for me, branches snagging my clothes and hair. "Shannon," it called, my name stretching into something unrecognizable. "Don't you want to play?" I ran until my lungs burned and my legs shook. Somewhere along the way, I lost Rachel's blanket and one of my shoes. Blood from my cut feet left a trail, but I couldn't stop. The thing's laughter grew closer, accompanied by a wet sliding sound like raw meat being dragged across bark. I don't remember finding the tent. One moment I was running through the darkness, the next I was diving through the zippered opening, collapsing between Matt and Rachel's sleeping forms. They didn't wake, didn't even stir, and later I would wonder if they had been drugged somehow, kept asleep by whatever haunted those woods. The thing's laughter faded, but didn't quite disappear. It lingered at the edge of hearing, mixing with the wind in the trees. I lay there until dawn, shivering despite the blankets I piled on, watching shadows move against the tent walls. We left the next morning. I made up an excuse about feeling sick, and Rachel's parents were surprisingly quick to agree. As we packed up, I noticed things I'd missed in the twilight of our arrival. The other campers were gone, all of them, leaving without a trace. The path to the bathroom seemed shorter in daylight, taking barely 5 minutes to walk. And my reflection wasn't quite right anymore. Sometimes, when I catch a glimpse of myself in mirrors or windows, my face seems to shift for a moment. My eyes glow blue. My smile stretches too wide. Rachel doesn't remember that night. Neither does Matt. When I tried to tell them what happened, their eyes went glassy and distant, and they changed the subject. I found Rachel's blanket on my doorstep a week later, neatly folded and smelling of decay. Sometimes my phone lights up at 1:17 a.m. with texts from numbers that don't exist. Ready to play again? The woods miss you. Would you rather? I've learned to sleep with the lights on, to avoid mirrors at night, to never ever go camping again. But sometimes in my dreams I'm back in that bathroom. Only this time, when the stall door opens, the thing wearing my face isn't alone. Matt and Rachel are there too, their bodies twisted into impossible shapes, their faces perfect copies but wrong, so wrong. And they're all wearing my smile. I found a note in my jacket pocket yesterday, Matt's jacket, the one I never returned. The paper was damp, the ink running like fresh blood. The game isn't over, Shannon. In the woods or in the bathroom, you still have to choose. Below that, in handwriting that looked disturbingly like my own, "See you at the next camping trip." It was a crisp October morning when I, Christopher Anderson, decided to document the events that unfolded during what was supposed to be a simple camping trip with my college friends. The chill in the air seemed to foreshadow the horror that awaited us in the depths of the forest. Little did we know that our lives would be forever changed by the time the sun rose again. Fred Williams was never the type to stand out in a crowd. In high school, he was the quiet loner who kept to himself, his nose often buried in a book or his eyes fixed on the horizon, lost in thought. It wasn't until college that Fred began to come out of his shell, thanks in large part to his girlfriend, Melanie Cooper. Melanie was Fred's polar opposite in many ways. Where he was reserved, she was outgoing. Where he preferred solitude, she thrived in social situations. Her warm smile and infectious laugh drew people to her like moths to a flame. It was a mystery to many how these two had ended up together. But to those who knew them well, it made perfect sense. They balanced each other perfectly. Pete Donovan, Fred's best friend, was the third member of our unlikely quartet. Pete was the kind of guy who walked into a room and immediately commanded attention. He was loud, boisterous, and had an ego the size of Texas. But beneath that brash exterior was a heart of gold. Pete cared deeply for his friends, even if he had an odd way of showing it sometimes. Rounding out our group was Jacqueline Rodriguez, Pete's girlfriend. Jacqueline was the quintessential gossip queen. She always seemed to know what was happening before anyone else, and she wasn't shy about sharing that information. Her penchant for spreading rumors had gotten her into hot water more than once, but she always managed to charm her way out of trouble. As I sit here recounting these details about my friends, I can't help but feel a pang of nostalgia mixed with dread. If only we had known what fate had in store for us, perhaps we would have chosen a different path. But hindsight, as they say, is 20/20ths. The idea for the camping trip came about during one of our regular study sessions at the college library. We were all feeling the pressure of midterms, and Pete, in his typical fashion, suggested we blow off some steam. "What we need," he declared, slamming his textbook shut, "is a good old-fashioned camping trip, just the four of us, out in the wilderness away from all this stress." Jacqueline wrinkled her nose at the suggestion. "Camping? Pete, honey, you know how I feel about bugs and dirt." "Come on, Jackie," Pete cajoled, using the nickname he knew she secretly loved. "It'll be fun. We can roast marshmallows, tell ghost stories, and hey, maybe you'll even pick up some juicy gossip from the woodland creatures." That last bit made Jacqueline crack a smile despite her reservations. Melanie, always the peacemaker, chimed in. "I think it sounds like a great idea. What do you think, Fred?" Fred, who had been quietly listening to the exchange, nodded slowly. "I know a good spot," he said. "It's in the woods near our hometown. I used to go there with the Boy Scouts." And just like that, our fate was sealed. We spent the next week planning and preparing for our trip. Fred took charge of the logistics, making sure we had all the necessary equipment. Melanie was in charge of food, promising to bring enough marshmallows to feed a small army. Pete volunteered to handle transportation, while Jacqueline complained, but we all knew she'd end up enjoying herself once we got there. None of us could have predicted how wrong we were. The day of our departure arrived, and we piled into Pete's beat-up Chevy Suburban. The vehicle had seen better days, but Pete swore it was reliable. "This baby's gotten me through thick and thin," he boasted as we loaded our gear into the back. The drive to the campsite was filled with laughter and excited chatter. Jacqueline regaled us with the latest campus gossip, while Pete sang along, badly, to the classic rock station on the radio. Fred sat quietly in the passenger seat, occasionally offering directions to Pete. As we drove deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to grow taller and closer together. The sunlight filtering through the canopy created dappled patterns on the road, and the air grew cooler. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, but I chalked it up to my overactive imagination. Finally, after what seemed like hours of driving, we arrived at the clearing Fred had chosen for our campsite. It was a beautiful spot, surrounded by towering pines and oaks. A small stream burbled nearby, its clear water sparkling in the afternoon sun. "This is perfect, Fred," Melanie exclaimed, giving her boyfriend a quick peck on the cheek. Fred blushed, clearly pleased with her approval. We set about setting up camp, working together like a well-oiled machine. Fred and Pete tackled the tents while Melanie and Jacqueline gathered firewood. I helped where I could, but mostly I found myself observing my friends, marveling at how well we worked together despite our differences. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the clearing, we gathered around the fire pit Fred had constructed. Pete produced a cooler full of beer from the back of the Suburban, earning a whoop of approval from Jacqueline. "Now it's a party," she grinned, cracking open a can. Melanie rolled her eyes good-naturedly. "Just remember, we're in the middle of nowhere. If you drink too much and need to pee in the middle of the night, you're on your own." We all laughed, but there was an undercurrent of nervousness to our mirth. As the darkness closed in around us, the forest seemed to come alive with strange sounds. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the snap of a twig underfoot. Each noise made us jump a little, though we tried to hide it from each other. Little did we know our fear was not unfounded. Something was indeed watching us from the shadows, biding its time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As the night wore on and the fire burned low, Pete suggested we tell ghost stories. "It's tradition," he insisted, his words slightly slurred from the beer. "You can't go camping without telling ghost stories." Jacqueline groaned. "Do we have to? You know I hate scary stories." "Don't be such a baby," Pete teased. "I'll go first, and I promise it won't be too scary." Pete's story, as it turned out, was more comical than frightening. It was a rehashed version of the classic Hook Man urban legend, but in Pete's telling, the protagonist ended up punching the killer in the face and saving the day. We all groaned and pelted him with marshmallows when he finished. "That was terrible," Jacqueline laughed. "My turn. I'll show you how it's done." Jacqueline's story was a bit more chilling. She spun a tale of a babysitter receiving threatening phone calls, only to discover that the calls were coming from inside the house. It was a story we'd all heard before, but Jacqueline's dramatic delivery had us on the edge of our seats. Melanie went next, telling a story about a girl staying at her roommate's creepy old house during a storm. The story ended with a shocking twist that made even Pete jump a little. Finally, it was Fred's turn. As he began to speak, his usually quiet demeanor seemed to shift. His voice took on a deeper, more serious tone, and his eyes gleamed in the firelight. "I'm going to tell you about something that really happened," he said, his gaze sweeping over each of us. "Something that happened right here in these woods." We all leaned in closer, drawn in by the intensity in Fred's voice. "There's a demon that roams these forests," Fred began. "It's been here for centuries, preying on the souls of the weak and unsuspecting. It's responsible for countless unexplained deaths and disappearances over the years." He went on to describe the demon in vivid detail, a nightmarish creature with the body of an ape, the hooves of a goat, the wings of a bat, and the head of a serpent. As he spoke, I could almost see the beast lurking just beyond the circle of firelight. "They say you can summon the demon by speaking its name," Fred continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Its name is—" He paused for dramatic effect, and we all held our breath. "To Sorak!" Fred suddenly shouted, causing us all to jump and spill our drinks. For a moment, silence reigned in the clearing. Then, as if on cue, a blood-curdling howl echoed through the trees. We all froze, our eyes wide with fear. "Very funny, Fred," Pete said after a moment, his voice shaky. "You almost had us going there for a minute." But Fred wasn't laughing. His face had gone pale, and he was staring into the darkness beyond our campfire with an expression of abject terror. I didn't do that," he whispered. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. We tried to laugh off the incident, blaming it on an overzealous coyote or some other woodland creature, but none of us could shake the feeling of dread that had settled over our campsite. We retired to our tents early, each couple in their own shelter. As I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest, I couldn't help but replay Fred's story in my mind. The description of the demon was so vivid, so terrifying, that it seemed to have taken on a life of its own in my imagination. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a scream. It was Jacqueline's voice, high and panicked, cutting through the night like a knife. I scrambled out of my tent, heart pounding. The clearing was eerily quiet now, the only sound the crackling of the dying embers in our fire pit. Pete and Jacqueline's tent was empty, the flap hanging open. "Fred, Melanie," I called out, my voice trembling. They emerged from their tent, looking just as confused and frightened as I felt. "What's going on?" Melanie asked, clinging to Fred's arm. "Where are Pete and Jackie?" Fred's face was grim. "We need to find them," he said, reaching for the flashlights we'd left by the fire. We spread out, calling for our friends as we searched the surrounding woods. The beam of my flashlight danced over the trees, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to move and shift of their own accord. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot made me jump. It was Melanie who found Pete first, or rather, what was left of Pete. His body hung from a tree branch, grotesquely mutilated, his eyes wide and staring in frozen terror. Melanie's scream echoed through the forest, a sound of pure, unadulterated horror. I ran towards her voice, my heart in my throat, but by the time I reached the spot, Melanie was gone. Only her flashlight remained, lying on the forest floor next to Pete's body. "Fred!" I yelled, panic rising in my chest. "Fred, where are you?" There was no answer. I was alone in the dark woods, surrounded by unseen horrors. And then I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere behind me. I turned slowly, my flashlight beam trembling. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, standing not 10 feet away, was the creature from Fred's story. It was real, and it was more terrifying than any description could have conveyed. Its eyes glowed red in the darkness, fixed on me with predatory intensity. I could smell its fetid breath, see the saliva dripping from its razor-sharp fangs. This was it, I thought. This was how I was going to die. But then something strange happened. The creature's gaze shifted, looking at something behind me. Its expression, if such a thing could be said to have an expression, changed from hunger to fear. I turned to see what had frightened the demon, and my jaw dropped in shock. There stood Fred, but not the Fred I knew. This Fred's eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and his mouth was curved in a cruel smile that sent chills down my spine. "Hello, old friend," Fred said, his voice deeper and more resonant than I'd ever heard it. "Did you miss me?" The demon let out a roar of fury and charged at Fred. What happened next was almost too fast for my eyes to follow. Fred moved with inhuman speed and grace, dodging the demon's attacks and landing blows of his own. The two creatures, for I could no longer think of Fred as human, battled fiercely, tearing up the forest around them. In the end, it was Fred who emerged victorious. He stood over the demon's broken body, panting heavily, his clothes torn and bloody. Then he turned to me, and I saw that his eyes had returned to normal. "Chris," he said, his voice weak and trembling, "I'm so sorry you had to see that." As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, Fred and I sat by the rekindled campfire. The bodies of our friends had been respectfully covered and laid out nearby. We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of the night's events hanging heavy between us. Finally, Fred spoke. "I owe you an explanation," he said, his voice hoarse and tired. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Fred took a deep breath and began his story. "The demon I told you about last night, it's real. It's been haunting these woods for centuries, claiming victims and spreading fear. But what I didn't tell you is that I've encountered it before." He paused, his eyes distant as if looking into the past. "When I was a child, my father and I were in a car accident not far from here. The official report said my father lost control of the vehicle, but I knew the truth. I saw the demon appear in the middle of the road, causing my father to swerve and crash into a tree." Fred's hands were shaking now, and I could see tears forming in his eyes. "My father, he was possessed by the demon in his final moments. I watched helplessly as it took control of him, forcing him to say terrible things before he died. But in his last breath he managed to fight back. He told me a secret, a way to defeat the demon." "What was it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "A ritual," Fred replied. "An ancient spell passed down through generations of those who fought against the demon. It allows a person to take on the demon's power, to fight fire with fire, so to speak. But it comes at a terrible cost." I thought back to the Fred I'd seen fighting the demon, the inhuman strength and speed he'd displayed. "You performed the ritual," I said. It wasn't a question. Fred nodded solemnly. "I've spent years preparing for this moment, waiting for the demon to show itself again. I brought us here knowing the risks, hoping to finally end this once and for all. But I never imagined, His voice broke, and he gestured helplessly at the covered bodies of our friends. "Why didn't you tell us?" I asked, a mix of anger and sadness welling up inside me. "We could have been prepared. We could have—" "No," Fred cut me off. "Knowing wouldn't have saved them. The demon was too powerful. I'm so sorry, Chris. I never meant for any of this to happen." We lapsed into silence again, each lost in our own thoughts. As the sun rose higher in the sky, painting the forest in hues of gold and green, I found myself wondering about the nature of good and evil, about the sacrifices we make in the name of protecting others. Fred had saved my life, had potentially saved countless future lives by destroying the demon. But at what cost? The lives of our friends? His own humanity? As if reading my thoughts, Fred spoke again. "There's something else you need to know, Chris. The ritual, it's not a one-time thing. I've taken the demon's power into myself, but I can feel it trying to take control. I don't know how long I can hold it back." The weight of Fred's words hung heavy in the air between us. I stared at my friend, trying to reconcile the quiet, bookish Fred I knew with the powerful, tormented figure before me. "What does that mean for you?" I asked, dreading the answer. Fred's eyes met mine, and I saw a mixture of fear and resignation in them. "It means I'm dangerous, Chris. The demon's power, it's like a poison spreading through me. I can feel its influence growing stronger with each passing moment." He stood up abruptly, pacing back and forth in front of the dying fire. "I thought I could control it, use it to protect people. But now I'm not so sure. What if I become the very thing I sought to destroy?" I rose to my feet, approaching Fred cautiously. "There has to be a way to reverse it, right? Some kind of counter-ritual or—" Fred shook his head, cutting me off. "There's no going back. The ritual is permanent. I made my choice, and now I have to live with the consequences." A heavy silence fell between us, broken only by the soft crackling of the embers and the gentle rustling of leaves in the morning breeze. In the distance, a bird began to sing, a hauntingly beautiful melody that seemed at odds with the grim reality we faced. "What will you do now?" I asked, finally breaking the silence. Fred turned to face me, his expression resolute. "I can't stay here. I can't risk hurting anyone else. I need to leave, go somewhere isolated where I can learn to control this thing inside me." My heart sank at his words, but I knew he was right. The Fred standing before me was no longer just my friend. He was something more, something potentially dangerous. "Where will you go?" I asked. "I don't know," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Somewhere far away from civilization. Maybe the mountains or the deep wilderness. Somewhere I can't hurt anyone if I lose control." I nodded, understanding the gravity of his decision. "What about Melanie's family? Pete's? Jacqueline's? What do we tell them?" Fred's face contorted with pain at the mention of our lost friends. "The truth would destroy them, Chris. It's better they don't know. Tell them there was an accident, a wildfire or a flash flood. Anything but the truth." The idea of lying to the families of our friends made me sick to my stomach. But I knew Fred was right. How could we possibly explain what had really happened? As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Fred and I set about the grim task of dealing with the aftermath of the night's horrors. We carefully wrapped the bodies of our friends in blankets, treating them with all the respect and care we could muster. Fred insisted on carrying them back to the campsite himself, his newfound strength allowing him to bear burdens that would have been impossible for a normal man. We packed up the campsite in silence, erasing all traces of our presence. As we loaded the last of the gear into Pete's Suburban, Fred turned to me, his eyes filled with a sadness that seemed to go beyond mere grief. "Chris, I need you to do something for me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "When you get back to civilization, I need you to destroy everything. All the research I've done on the demon, all the books and notes in my dorm room. Burn it all. No one can ever know about this." I nodded, understanding the importance of his request. "What about you? How will I know if you're okay?" Fred managed a weak smile. "You won't. It's better that way. For both of us." As we stood there, the weight of everything that had happened, and everything that was still to come, pressed down on us like a physical force. I wanted to say something, anything, to ease the burden we both carried, but words seemed woefully inadequate. In the end, we embraced, a fierce hug that spoke volumes more than words ever could. When we broke apart, I saw a glimmer of the old Fred in his eyes, a flash of the quiet, kind friend I had known. "Take care of yourself, Chris," he said softly. "And I'm sorry for everything." Before I could respond, Fred turned and walked into the forest. I watched him go, his figure growing smaller and smaller until he disappeared among the trees. Part of me wanted to call out, to beg him to come back, to find another way. But I knew this was how it had to be. I climbed into the driver's seat of the Suburban, my hands shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. As I drove away from the campsite, leaving behind the scene of so much horror and loss, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me go. But when I blinked, it was gone. The drive back to civilization was a blur. My mind raced with thoughts of how I would explain what had happened, how I would face the families of our lost friends, how I would ever be able to move on from this nightmare. When I finally reached the outskirts of our town, I pulled over to the side of the road. I sat there for a long time, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I thought about Fred, out there somewhere in the wilderness, battling the darkness within him. I thought about Pete, Melanie, and Jacqueline, their lives cut tragically short. And I thought about myself, the sole survivor, burdened with a truth I could never share. As I sat there, watching the sun sink towards the horizon, I made a decision. I would honor Fred's request. I would destroy all evidence of what we had encountered in those woods. I would tell the necessary lies to give the families of our friends some closure. And then, I would leave this place behind. There was a whole world out there, far from the shadows of this forest. Maybe if I went far enough, I could find a way to live with the memories of that terrible night. But deep down, I knew the truth. The horror we had faced, the losses we had suffered, the sacrifices that had been made, they would stay with me forever. I started the engine and pulled back onto the road, heading towards an uncertain future. As I drove, I thought about Fred, out there somewhere in the wilderness, battling the darkness within him. I thought about Pete, Melanie, and Jacqueline, their lives cut tragically short. And I thought about myself, the sole survivor, burdened with a truth I could never share. The miles rolled by, and with each one I felt a small measure of the weight lifting from my shoulders. I couldn't change what had happened, but I could choose how to move forward. I decided then and there that I would live my life to the fullest, in honor of the friends I had lost. As night fell and the stars came out, I crossed the state line. In my rearview mirror, the forests of my hometown faded into darkness. Ahead of me lay open road, new possibilities, and the chance for a fresh start. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay in that place of horror and loss. The memories would always be with me, a constant reminder of the thin veil between our world and the dark forces that lurk just out of sight. But I was determined to build a new life, one day at a time. As I drove on into the night, I made a silent promise to myself and to the memory of my friends. I would live, I would remember, and I would never again take for granted the precious, fragile nature of life and friendship. The road stretched out before me, leading to places unknown. As the last light of day faded from the sky, I realized that while one chapter of my life had closed, another was just beginning. Whatever lay ahead, I would face it with the strength and resilience forged in the crucible of that fateful camping trip. And so I drove on, leaving behind the horrors of the past and moving towards whatever the future might hold. The darkness had changed me, but it hadn't defeated me. In the end, that would have to be enough. As I sit here in the dim light of my apartment, trying to make sense of the horrors that have unfolded over the past few weeks, I can't help but wonder if sharing this story will bring me any semblance of peace. My name is Caleb Robertson, and what I'm about to recount may seem impossible, perhaps even the ramblings of a madman, but I swear on everything I hold dear, every word is true. It all began about 3 weeks ago, when I decided to go camping with 3 of my old high school buddies in the Huntsville National Forest in Texas. We'd been doing this for years, getting together at least once annually to reconnect and escape the pressures of our everyday lives. The group consisted of myself, Ryan Thompson, Zach Miller, and Kevin Porter. We were all in our mid-20s, with the others attending various colleges while I had opted for a job straight out of high school. Our plan was simple. We'd go backpacking deep into the forest, living off the fish we'd catch and whatever small game we could trap. We'd done similar trips in Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico, so we felt pretty confident in our outdoor skills. This time it was my turn to choose our destination, and I picked Huntsville, or more accurately, Huntsville, New Waverly. The day we set out was perfect. Clear skies, a light breeze, and the promise of adventure hanging in the air. We parked our car at the designated camping spot and began our trek into the forest. The first few hours were filled with laughter and catching up. Ryan regaled us with stories of his latest romantic escapades, while Zach complained about his demanding engineering courses. Kevin, always the quiet one, mostly listened and occasionally chimed in with a witty remark. As dusk began to settle, we decided to make camp. We found a small clearing that seemed perfect, level ground, a nearby stream, and enough dead wood scattered around to build a decent fire. We set up our tents and gathered firewood, falling into the familiar rhythm of our annual ritual. Once the fire was crackling merrily, we settled in for our favorite camping tradition, trying to scare each other with weird stories. Kevin started off with a tale about a hitchhiker he'd allegedly picked up, who disappeared from his car while he was driving. Zach followed with a story about strange lights he'd seen in the desert during a solo camping trip. Ryan, always one for dramatics, launched into a long-winded ghost story that had us rolling our eyes more than shivering in fear. It was around this time that we noticed a faint, peculiar smell in the air. It was barely there, just on the edge of perception, but undeniably odd. We couldn't quite place it, so we shrugged it off and continued our storytelling. As the night wore on, Ryan announced he needed to relieve himself and wandered off into the darkness. We barely paid attention, continuing our conversation around the fire. But when he came running back moments later, his jeans soaked and his face as white as a sheet, we knew something was terribly wrong. Ryan was gasping for breath, his eyes wide with terror. Before any of us could ask what had happened, he was screaming at us to follow him and took off back into the forest. Confused and alarmed, we grabbed our flashlights and ran after him, the warmth and safety of our campfire quickly fading behind us. As we ran, guided only by the frantic bobbing of Ryan's flashlight ahead, we began to hear something that made our blood run cold, a faint scream and crying in the distance, coming from the direction we were heading. The forest seemed to close in around us, the darkness between the trees almost palpable. Suddenly Ryan slowed down and we nearly crashed into him. In the gloom ahead, we could make out the silhouette of a dilapidated cabin. It looked ancient and abandoned, its windows covered in a thick layer of grime. But from one of those windows we could see a faint, flickering light. The crying was louder now, clearly coming from inside the cabin. It was a heart-wrenching sound, filled with pain and despair. We approached the front door cautiously, our hearts pounding in our chests. Ryan, still in the lead, raised his hand to knock. The moment his knuckles touched the weathered wood, the crying stopped abruptly. We all held our breath, straining our ears in the sudden silence. Then we heard it. Heavy footsteps inside the cabin, moving quickly towards the door. There was a loud slam against the door that made us all jump, followed by the sound of a bolt being drawn back. And then, nothing. We waited, our nerves stretched to the breaking point, but nothing happened. After what felt like an eternity, Zach suggested we check around the house. None of us wanted to be left alone, so we moved as a group, our flashlights darting nervously from shadow to shadow. At the back of the cabin, we found a window set high in the wall. Kevin, the tallest among us, volunteered to take a look inside. Ryan and I gave him a boost, watching anxiously as he wiped away years of dirt and cobwebs from the glass. Kevin pressed his face against the window, squinting to see inside. For a moment, everything was still. Then, without warning, he sucked in a sharp breath and let out a blood-curdling scream. He fell backward, nearly crushing Ryan and me as we tried to catch him. Kevin was hysterical, thrashing and screaming incoherently. We tried to calm him down, but he was beyond reason. Suddenly, he broke free from our grasp and took off running towards our campsite. Frightened and confused, we chased after him, unwilling to let anyone get separated. When we finally caught up to Kevin at the campsite, he was still in a state of panic. I busied myself rekindling the fire, my hands shaking so badly I could barely strike the matches. Zach and Ryan managed to get Kevin to sit down, but he wouldn't stop screaming and gasping for air. We spent the rest of the night huddled around the fire, jumping at every snapping twig and rustling leaf. Kevin's screams gradually subsided into whimpers, but he remained in a catatonic state, mumbling unintelligibly to himself. As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the trees, Ryan and I decided to go back and investigate the cabin in the daylight. We retraced our steps from the night before, but when we reached the spot where the cabin should have been, we found nothing. No cabin, no clearing, not even a foundation or any sign that a structure had ever stood there. What we did find was a smell, the same faint, unidentifiable odor from the night before, but now much stronger. It was a sickly, sweet stench of decay, like something long dead and rotting in the summer heat. Unsettled and confused, we made our way back to the campsite. The scene that greeted us there was horrifying. Kevin had chewed into the sides of his own face, blood dripping down his chin and staining his shirt. He had swallowed so much of his own blood that he was vomiting, his face a mask of pain and terror. Zach looked like he had aged years overnight, his face haggard with exhaustion and fear. Kevin, through his self-inflicted wounds, managed to croak out that we needed to leave immediately. We started packing up our gear as quickly as we could, our hands fumbling with tent poles and sleeping bags. As if to punctuate the urgency of our situation, the sky began to darken ominously, and a heavy rain started to fall. Kevin's panic seemed to escalate with each passing moment. He grabbed a large stick and began threatening us, saying he'd knock us out and drag us from the forest himself if we didn't move faster. The tension finally snapped when Ryan started yelling back at him, and a fight broke out between the two. Zach and I managed to separate them, and we finished packing in tense silence. As we began our trek back to civilization, the rain intensified, turning the forest floor into a treacherous, muddy mess. After what felt like hours of slogging through the downpour, we reached the creek we had crossed on our way in, but the gentle stream we had easily forded just a day before had transformed into a raging torrent, swollen with rainwater and far too dangerous to cross. Kevin's fragile composure shattered completely at this setback. He began screaming at Ryan, blaming him for taking too long to pack up the tent. The argument quickly escalated, with Kevin becoming more and more unhinged by the second. It took all of our combined efforts to calm Kevin down enough to tell us what he had seen in the cabin window the night before. His account sent chills down our spines. According to Kevin, the moment he put his face to the glass, another face appeared on the other side, mimicking his position exactly. The face began to smile, the grin growing wider and wider until it seemed to split the entire face. The eyes and mouth were pitch black, darker than any shadow Kevin had ever seen. Then, Kevin said, a massive shadowy figure appeared behind the face in the window. It raised something, Kevin couldn't tell what, and brought it down in a vicious arc, slicing the smiling face clean off. The severed face remained stuck to the window, its impossible grin still in place as it slowly slid down the glass, accompanied by quiet, chilling laughter. Ryan, despite his earlier anger, was visibly shaken by Kevin's story. We all were. But with the creek blocking our path back to the car, we had no choice but to follow it, hoping to find a safe place to cross. As we walked along the swollen banks of the creek, we began to notice something strange floating in the water. Toys. Not just any toys, but old, weathered dolls. Barbie dolls and baby dolls, dozens of them, perhaps even hundreds, all bobbing along in the muddy current. Ryan, curiosity overcoming his fear, reached out and snagged one of the dolls as it floated by. It was a baby doll, its once cheerful face now discolored and warped by time and water. As Ryan turned it over in his hands, we heard a faint gurgling sound coming from within the doll. It was some kind of voice chip, clearly damaged by water but still functioning. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakable. A child's voice, laughing and then whispering. The sound made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and I could see the others were equally disturbed. Ryan quickly tossed the doll back into the creek, and we continued our journey in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. As the day wore on and the sun began to set once more, our nerves became increasingly frayed. Kevin's whimpering grew louder, and we all began to see things moving in the shadows between the trees. At first, we dismissed it as tricks of the light or our overwrought imaginations. But as the sightings became more frequent and consistent, we could no longer deny that something was out there, watching us. Just as twilight was fading into true night, we stumbled into a clearing and found ourselves face to face with the impossible. The cabin. The same cabin we had encountered the night before. The same cabin that had vanished without a trace in the morning light. It stood before us now, as real and solid as the ground beneath our feet. Ryan, pushed to the breaking point by fear and frustration, declared that he'd had enough. He announced his intention to enter the cabin and confront whatever was inside, to prove to himself and to us that it was all just a product of our overactive imaginations. We tried to stop him, all of us, even Kevin in his semi-catatonic state. But Ryan was beyond reason. He shrugged off our restraining hands and marched towards the cabin, his face set in grim determination. As Ryan approached the cabin, the forest around us came alive with sound. Hundreds, maybe thousands of voices filled the air, the same gurgling, dying battery sound we had heard from the doll in the creek. But now it was a cacophony of laughter, whispers, and a tonal singing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Overwhelmed by the nightmarish chorus, we pushed past the cabin, half dragging Kevin along with us. The smell of decay grew stronger with each step, filling our nostrils and making us gag. We could hear crying and screaming in the distance, but we pressed on, driven by blind panic and the desperate need to escape this forest that had become a living nightmare. By some miracle, we eventually found a place where we could cross the creek safely. We stumbled out of the woods and back to our car, piling in without a word. The relief of reaching relative safety was palpable, but short-lived. As we drove towards the highway that would take us back to Houston, we found the road blocked by construction. A detour sign pointed us down a small, bumpy dirt road that led back into the woods. We hesitated, the thought of re-entering the forest filling us with dread, but we had no other choice. As we turned onto the dirt road, a figure emerged from the shadows at the roadside. It was a young woman, or at least it appeared to be at first glance. She looked distressed, her face bruised and her movements unsteady, as if she were drugged. The woman approached the passenger side of the car where Kevin was sitting. He didn't roll down the window or unlock the door, his earlier experiences having made him wary of anything and everything in this God-forsaken place. The woman pressed her face against the window, and as she did, her features began to change. her mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin, mirroring the face Kevin had described seeing in the cabin window. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I floored the accelerator and we sped away, leaving the grinning woman thing behind us. Kevin broke down, crying and screaming, and the rest of us weren't far behind, our nerves finally snapping under the weight of everything we'd experienced. We eventually made it back to the highway and drove straight through to my apartment in Houston. None of us spoke during the journey. There were no words to adequately express what we had been through. When we arrived, we went our separate ways without much discussion. The shared horror of our experience had paradoxically driven a wedge between us, each of us retreating into our own minds to try and process what had happened. In the days that followed, things only got stranger. Mike messaged me saying he was planning to go back to the forest. I tried to talk him out of it, but he was convinced that it had all been in our heads, that he needed to go back to prove to himself that he wasn't afraid. I haven't heard from him since. The stench from the forest seems to have followed me home. I smell it everywhere now, that sickly sweet odor of decay. I've become a virtual hermit, too afraid to leave my apartment or even answer the door. Last week, I noticed that everyone I encountered was acting strangely. People I've known for years, complete strangers on the street. They all watched me with an unsettling intensity, their expressions blank and their eyes wrong somehow. I went to my father's house for dinner, hoping that the familiar surroundings and his comforting presence would help settle my nerves. But when I arrived, I found him changed. He sat silently throughout the meal, just watching me with an unblinking stare. When I tried to engage him in conversation, he would only shake his head slowly, never uttering a word. As I was leaving, I turned to wave goodbye and saw that his eyes had turned completely black, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream. I ran, my heart pounding in my chest. When I returned later with the police, there was no sign of my father. The house was empty and looked as if it hadn't been lived in for years. I tried calling Alex, but his family acted as if they'd never heard of him. The police were no help either. Halfway through my report, the line filled with static, and I could hear faint whispers and laughter in the background. Now, as I sit in my apartment, I can feel my grip on reality slipping away. Someone keeps pushing pieces of dismembered dolls through my mail slot. When I try to call anyone, all I hear is static and the sound of dying battery-powered dolls crying and screaming. My television, which hasn't worked in months, suddenly came to life while I was in the bathroom. I could hear it playing, but when I went to check, the screen was dark and silent. The neighbors above me have started screaming in pain, interspersed with the sound of heavy footsteps and things being thrown around. From the apartment next door, I hear what sounds like a baby crying, but the sobs gradually morph into the mechanical wail of a doll with dying batteries. My phone rings incessantly, and when I answer, I hear Alex's voice speaking in a language I've never heard before, a tongue that sounds ancient and wrong in ways I can't begin to describe. And now, as I write this, someone is knocking at my door. The knocks have turned to pounding, and I can hear the bolts unlocking one by one. I've run to the door, frantically relocking each bolt as it mysteriously unlocks itself. My heart is pounding so hard I fear it might burst from my chest. The pounding on the door continues, growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment. I stumble back to my computer, desperate to finish this account, to leave some record of what's happened in case I don't make it through this night. The pounding has stopped now, replaced by an eerie silence that's somehow even more terrifying. I can hear my own ragged breathing, loud in the stillness of the apartment. Then, a sound that chills me to my very core, the slow, deliberate turning of the doorknob. I hold my breath, watching in horror as the door begins to open, inch by agonizing inch. A fetid odor wafts in, that same sickly sweet stench of decay that's been haunting me since the forest. I want to run, to hide, but my body won't respond. I'm frozen in place, my eyes fixed on the widening gap. A hand appears, gripping the edge of the door. It's pale and bloated, the skin mottled with patches of decay. As the door swings wider, I see a figure standing in the hallway. It's Ryan, or what's left of him. His clothes are tattered and caked with mud, his skin pallid and sagging. But it's his face that truly horrifies me. It's no longer his own. Instead, it's that same impossible grin we saw on the woman by the road, stretching from ear to ear, black eyes gleaming with malevolent glee. "Caleb," it says, in a voice that's both Ryan's and not Ryan's, "we've been waiting for you to come home." I finally find my voice and scream, the sound tearing from my throat. I lunge for the window, my only possible escape route. As I struggle with the latch, I hear more footsteps in the hallway. Glancing back, I see Kevin and Zach joining Ryan, their faces bearing the same grotesque grins. The window finally gives way and I clamber out onto the fire escape. I live on the 3rd floor and the ground seems impossibly far away, but I have no choice. I can hear them entering my apartment, their whispered laughter carried on the night air. I begin to descend the fire escape as quickly as I can, the metal rattling ominously beneath my feet. I'm 1 floor from the ground when I hear a sound from above. They've followed me out the window. My foot touches the pavement and I take off running, not daring to look back. The streets are deserted, the streetlights casting long shadows that seem to reach for me as I pass. I can hear them behind me, their footsteps echoing off the buildings. I run without direction, driven purely by terror. My lungs burn and my legs ache, but I don't dare stop. I turn down an alley, hoping to lose them, but it's a dead end. I spin around, ready to retrace my steps, but they're there, blocking the entrance to the alley. Ryan, Kevin, and Zach stand shoulder to shoulder, those impossible grins still plastered across their faces. Behind them, I can see more figures emerging from the shadows. My father, Alex's family, the woman from the forest road, all wearing the same horrifying smile. "Why are you running, Caleb?" Ryan asks, his voice a grotesque parody of friendship. "Don't you want to come home?" I press my back against the wall, my mind racing. There's no way out, no escape. As they begin to advance down the alley, I close my eyes, bracing myself for whatever comes next. But the attack I'm expecting doesn't come. Instead, I feel a hand on my shoulder, gentle but firm. My eyes snap open and I find myself staring into the face of an old man I've never seen before. His eyes are kind, his expression grave. "Wake up, son," he says, his voice cutting through the nightmare like a knife. "It's time to wake up." I blink, confused. The old man and the alley fade away, replaced by the sterile white of a hospital room. I'm lying in a bed, tubes and wires connecting me to various machines that beep steadily in the background. A doctor is standing over me, her hand on my shoulder. It takes me a moment to realize that she was the old man in my dream. Hallucination, whatever it was. "Welcome back, Mr. Robertson," she says with a smile. "You gave us quite a scare." As my mind slowly clears, the doctor explains what happened. Our camping trip had gone horribly wrong, but not in the way I remembered. There was no cabin, no dolls in the creek, no grinning monsters. The truth in some ways was far more mundane, yet no less tragic. We had indeed gone camping in the Huntsville National Forest, but on our second night there, we'd been caught in a sudden violent storm. A flash flood had swept through our campsite, catching us all off guard. Ryan and Kevin had been carried away by the raging waters. Their bodies were found 2 days later, several miles downstream. Zach and I had managed to cling to a tree, but we'd both been injured. Zach had hit his head on a rock and lost consciousness. He was currently in another room in the ICU, still in critical condition. I had been more fortunate, suffering only a broken arm and some cuts and bruises. But the trauma of the event, combined with a high fever from an infection, had sent my mind spiraling into a complex, terrifying hallucination. I'd been in and out of consciousness for over a week, trapped in the nightmare my brain had constructed to try and make sense of what had happened. As the doctor continues to explain, I feel a wave of grief wash over me. Ryan and Kevin are gone, really gone. Zach might not make it. The horror of my hallucinations fades in comparison to the stark reality of our loss, but mixed with the grief is a profound sense of relief. The monsters, the cabin, the living dolls, none of it was real. The world hasn't turned into a waking nightmare. My father is fine. Alex's family hasn't forgotten him, and there are no grinning creatures waiting to drag me back to some hellish forest. As I lay in the hospital bed, trying to process everything, I realized that the true horror wasn't in the fantastical elements of my hallucination. It was in the very real tragedy that my mind was trying to shield me from. The loss of my friends, the close brush with death, the sheer random cruelty of nature. These were the true terrors that my brain had twisted into monsters and impossible grins. I know that the road ahead will be difficult. There will be funerals to attend, grieving families to console, and my own trauma to work through. But as I watch the sunlight streaming through the hospital window, I feel a glimmer of hope. The nightmare is over. Now it's time to wake up and face the day. Some memories haunt you forever, lingering in the darkest corners of your mind, refusing to fade even as the years pass. What happened that night in Flamborough is one of those memories, a nightmare that became reality, leaving an indelible mark on my psyche that time hasn't managed to erase. The spring of 2009 found me at my lowest point. I had just ended a relationship that had consumed 3 years of my life, a love that had prompted us to uproot ourselves from the familiar streets of Calgary to start fresh in Toronto. The cruel irony was that our relationship crumbled almost immediately after the move, leaving us trapped together in a small apartment, forced to navigate the awkward dance of ex-lovers sharing space in a city where we knew virtually no one. Every morning brought the same suffocating tension, every night the same uncomfortable silence. The worst part wasn't the breakup itself, it was the crushing loneliness that followed. Toronto, despite its millions of inhabitants, felt impossibly empty. My daily routine became a monotonous blur of work, avoiding my ex at home, and trying to piece together what had gone wrong. The city's endless concrete canyons seemed to mirror my state of mind. Cold, gray, and increasingly claustrophobic. It was during one particularly dreary lunch break at the technical college where I was studying that Michael, a classmate I'd grown somewhat close to, made the suggestion that would change everything. "You need to get out of the city," he said, picking at his sandwich. "I know this perfect spot for camping and fishing about an hour outside Toronto near where I grew up. Grindstone Creek. It's beautiful this time of year, and the smallmouth bass fishing is incredible." The idea of escape, even temporary, was intoxicating. I hadn't realized how desperately I needed to break free from the urban prison I'd built around myself until that moment. When Michael described the location, pristine forests, meandering creeks, and absolute solitude, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. We spent the next few days planning the trip, gathering supplies and checking weather forecasts. Michael knew the area well, having grown up in Flamborough, and his enthusiasm was contagious. He spoke of hidden fishing spots, the best times to catch bass, and the pure serenity of the countryside. Looking back now, I wish we'd spent more time researching the area's history, the local stories, the warnings that locals might have shared. But hindsight, as they say, is 20/20ths. Friday afternoon found us loading Michael's weathered Subaru with camping gear, fishing equipment, and enough supplies for a comfortable weekend in the wilderness. The drive out of Toronto felt like a physical transformation. With each mile we put between ourselves and the city, I could feel the weight lifting from my shoulders. The urban sprawl gradually gave way to rolling farmland, dense forests, and the promise of adventure. We arrived at our chosen spot just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across what appeared to be an abandoned farmer's field. The location was perfect, a grassy clearing bordered by thick forest on one side, and Grindstone Creek about 50 yards away on the other. No houses were visible, No signs of civilization apart from a distant dirt road. The solitude was exactly what I needed. Setting up camp took longer than expected, partly because we kept stopping to admire the scenery. The late spring air was crisp but not cold, carrying the sweet scent of wildflowers and the earthy aroma of the nearby forest. Birds called to each other from the trees, their songs a welcome change from the city's constant noise. We spent the remaining daylight fishing, and the creek lived up to Michael's promises. The water was clear and cool, teeming with smallmouth bass that seemed eager to take our lures. We caught and released several impressive fish, each one adding to the sense that this weekend was exactly what I needed to reset my life. As darkness fell, we built a campfire and settled in for what should have been a perfect evening. The flames cast dancing shadows across our faces as we cooked hot dogs and potatoes wrapped in foil. We had brought a selection of craft beers, and they tasted better there, under the stars, than they ever had in the city. Michael and I talked for hours, the kind of deep, meandering conversations that only seem possible around a campfire, far from the distractions of modern life. The night was clear, and the stars were incredible, the kind of view you never get in the city. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light, and shooting stars occasionally traced brief paths through the darkness. The only sounds were the crackling of our fire, the distant calls of nightbirds, and the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. We turned in just after midnight, sharing my 3-person tent. The temperature had dropped enough to make our sleeping bags comfortable, and the ground beneath was surprisingly soft. Michael fell asleep almost immediately, his quiet snoring mixing with the ambient sounds of the countryside. I stayed awake playing games on my phone, enjoying the peaceful solitude and the feeling that for the first time in months, everything was going to be okay. The last time I checked my phone, it was 1:27 a.m. I remembered the time precisely because it marked the last moment of normalcy, the final seconds before everything changed. I must have dozed off shortly after that, lulled to sleep by the gentle symphony of night sounds. The noise that woke me defied description. At first, my sleep-addled brain tried to categorize it as a coyote. We'd had them in Calgary, and I was familiar with their calls. But this was different. It was a high-pitched, yipping noise that seemed to exist in some unsettling space between human and animal. The sound had a quality to it that made my skin crawl, something that spoke to primitive parts of my brain and screamed danger. I lay there in my sleeping bag, suddenly hyper-aware of how exposed we were. The tent walls, which had seemed cozy earlier, now felt absurdly thin and vulnerable. The noise continued, rhythmic and insistent, like some twisted form of communication. Worse, it was getting closer. What had started as a distant sound was now clearly approaching our campsite. My anxiety disorder, which I'd managed to keep in check during the day, began to surge. My heart raced, my palms grew slick with sweat, and my breathing became shallow and rapid. When the sound seemed no more than 10 feet from the tent, I reached over and nudged Michael. "Hey," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fear coursing through my veins. "Are you awake?" "Yeah," he replied immediately, his voice tight with tension. "What the fuck is that noise?" We discussed our options in hushed tones, painfully aware of our lack of preparation. We hadn't brought anything for protection. No bear spray, no air horn, not even a BB gun. The food was properly stored in the car, but what if it was a rabid animal? The yipping continued, now seemingly circling the tent in an almost deliberate pattern. "I'm going to shine the light on it," Michael finally said, grabbing his heavy-duty flashlight. "Make some noise, try to scare it off." He unzipped the tent flap, and I watched as he pointed the beam into the darkness. What happened next is seared into my memory with horrifying clarity. Michael's leg buckled beneath him as if someone had cut his strings. He stumbled backward, nearly falling onto me. When he turned to face me, his expression made my blood freeze in my veins. I'd known Michael for years, through exams and breakups and family deaths, but I'd never seen him look like that. His face was drained of color, his eyes wide with a primal terror that no words could adequately describe. "It's not a coyote," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's a dude. It's some weird fucking dude." The yipping continued, but now that Michael had said it, the sound took on a horrifyingly human quality. It was someone making those noises. Someone standing in the darkness watching our tent, making sounds no human should make. "Look," Michael insisted, his voice trembling. "You have to look. I need to know I'm not crazy." My entire body was shaking as I moved toward the tent opening. My anxiety was screaming at me to stay put, to hide, to wake up from what had to be a nightmare, but I had to know. I forced myself to peer out into the darkness. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in a pale, sickly light that seemed to drain the color from the world. As my eyes adjusted, I saw him. He was standing no more than 15 feet away, swaying slightly like a puppet on invisible strings. He wore a baseball cap pulled low over his face, but that wasn't what made my stomach lurch into my throat. He was dressed in women's lingerie, a lacy negligee that looked almost silvery in the moonlight, with what appeared to be stockings on his legs. The garments were filthy and torn, covered in dark stains that I didn't want to identify, as if he'd been crawling through the forest in them. The yipping sounds were coming from him, his head tilted back slightly as he made those inhuman noises. As I watched, frozen in horror, his head slowly turned toward our tent. I ducked back inside before I could see his face, but the image of his silhouette against the moonlit sky was already permanently etched into my mind. "What do we do?" I whispered to Michael, my voice shaking uncontrollably. "What the fuck do we do?" We spent what felt like an eternity discussing our options in terrified whispers. Maybe he was just some drunk who had wandered from a party. Maybe if we showed we weren't afraid, even though we were terrified, he'd leave. Maybe if we called the police. But we had no cell service, a detail that now seemed horrifyingly significant. Finally, Michael took a deep breath and shouted, "Hey, get out of here! We're trying to sleep!" The yipping stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse, heavy with potential energy like the moment before a lightning strike. Then we heard footsteps, running footsteps, charging straight toward our tent. They stopped just outside the fabric wall. I could hear breathing, heavy and irregular, with an occasional soft sound that might have been laughter or sobbing. Michael and I started yelling together, our voices cracking with fear. "We have phones! We're calling the police right now!" The breathing continued for a moment longer. Then we heard footsteps again, this time moving away toward the road. The sound of movement through grass gradually faded until we couldn't hear anything but the normal sounds of the night. But the damage was done. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig became a potential threat. Neither of us slept. We sat in that tent, phones clutched in our hands despite the lack of signal, jumping at every sound. We talked in whispers about making a run for the car, but the thought of stepping outside the tent was paralyzing. What if he was still out there, watching, waiting? What if there were more of them? As soon as the sky began to lighten, we packed up camp in record time and got the hell out of there. The morning light revealed nothing. No footprints, no evidence of our nighttime visitor. The field looked peaceful, almost mockingly so, as if the events of the night had been nothing but a shared hallucination. On the drive back to Toronto, we tried to process what had happened. We were both embarrassed by how scared we'd been, and I think that shame led us to avoid talking about it afterward. We made excuses. Maybe it was someone playing a prank. Maybe we had imagined it. Maybe it wasn't as scary as we remembered. But deep down, we both knew the truth. We had encountered something that defied rational explanation, something that shouldn't exist in the safe, orderly world we thought we lived in. The following weeks were difficult. I couldn't sleep without checking the locks multiple times. Every unexpected sound made me jump. I researched the area obsessively, looking for similar incidents or local legends that might explain what we'd seen. I found nothing concrete, but there were whispers, Forum posts about strange encounters in the woods, missing persons reports that were never resolved, stories that locals told in hushed voices about things that came out at night. Years have passed, but I still think about that night. I wonder what might have happened if we'd been more vulnerable targets. Was he testing us? Was he dangerous or just disturbed? Sometimes I'll be lying in bed at night, almost asleep, and I'll hear a sound that reminds me of that awful yipping noise. Sleep doesn't come easily on those nights. The experience changed something fundamental in me. I became more cautious, more aware of how quickly a seemingly perfect moment can shatter into nightmare. I developed a deeper appreciation for the thin veneer of civilization that we drape over the world's darker aspects. Michael and I are still friends, but we never go camping anymore. Sometimes I catch him looking at wooded areas with a distant, troubled expression, and I know he's thinking about it too. The police reports I've read from that area over the years have revealed nothing conclusive, but they paint a disturbing picture. Hikers going missing, strange calls about noises in the night, abandoned camps found in unusual conditions. Nothing that directly connects to what we saw, but enough to make me wonder about what else might be out there. I still don't know what that man wanted, or if he was even fully human. The way he moved, those sounds he made, they seemed to exist in some uncanny valley between human and animal. All I know is that somewhere out there, maybe still in those woods near Grindstone Creek, there's someone who spends his nights making inhuman noises outside strangers' tents, wearing dirty lingerie and testing to see who might be inside. Sometimes on dark nights when I can't sleep, I wonder if he's still out there, still waiting, still watching, still making those sounds. And I wonder about the stories that will never be told, the ones that ended differently than ours did. The scariest part isn't the memory itself, though that's bad enough. It's not even the possibility that he's still out there. No, the scariest part is knowing that there are things in this world that exist in the spaces between what we can explain and what we can't, things that lurk just beyond the reach of our understanding. And sometimes, if we're very unlucky, we catch a glimpse of them, and that glimpse changes us forever. This isn't some campfire story or urban legend. This really happened, and no matter how much time passes, I can't shake the feeling that we only saw the beginning of something much darker. Something that's still out there, waiting in the woods for its next encounter. And maybe, just maybe, it's waiting for you too. It started as a typical road trip with my buddies, just a weekend getaway to unwind. We were headed to a cabin deep in the Adirondacks, far away from the city noise. My name is Zane Underwood, and I've always been the guy who planned our little adventures. This time, however, it seemed like the universe had other plans for us. We left early in the morning, the car packed with snacks, drinks, and enough enthusiasm to fuel a rocket. There were 4 of us, myself, Wes, Marco, and Tori. We'd been friends since college, bonded over our mutual love of the outdoors and the thrill of exploring the unknown. Our destination was supposed to be a secluded cabin I'd rented online, promising tranquility and the perfect spot for stargazing. The trip was supposed to take about 4 hours, but somewhere along the way, Marco insisted we take a detour. He had heard of a scenic route that supposedly offered breathtaking views of the mountains. It seemed like a good idea at the time, so we veered off the main highway onto a narrow, winding road. The scenery was indeed stunning, with dense forests stretching out on either side and the peaks of the Adirondacks looming in the distance. We were making good time until we hit a fork in the road that wasn't on the map. Wes, who was driving, glanced at me for direction, but I was just as puzzled. "Let's take the left," Marco suggested from the back seat. "It feels right." "Feels right?" Tori mocked. "Since when do you have a GPS in your gut?" We all laughed, and Wes shrugged, turning left. The road seemed less maintained, with patches of dirt and gravel. We drove on, the car jostling with each bump, But the forest around us was captivating. After about 30 minutes, though, the road narrowed even further, and the trees seemed to close in on us. "Are we lost?" Tori asked, her tone shifting from playful to concerned. "No, we're not lost," I said, though doubt was creeping in. The GPS had lost signal, and our phones were barely getting a bar. We pressed on, hoping to find a landmark or a sign. That's when we saw it. A dilapidated signpost, half hidden by overgrown shrubs. It pointed toward a place called Hollisville, with the words barely legible. None of us had heard of it, but it seemed like our only option. Wes turned onto the gravel road it indicated. The path was rough, the trees thickening into a dense canopy overhead, blotting out most of the sunlight. The deeper we went, the more uneasy we all became. Conversation died down, replaced by the sound of tires crunching over gravel and the occasional rustle from the forest. After what felt like an eternity, we saw the first sign of civilization, a rusted-out pickup truck abandoned on the side of the road. It looked ancient, like it hadn't been touched in decades. Wes slowed down and we all peered at it, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. "Should we turn back?" Wes asked, his voice tinged with unease. "We've come this far," Marco said, though his bravado seemed forced. "Let's just find this town and ask for directions." We pressed on, and soon the road opened up to what could only be described as a ghost town. Hollisville was a cluster of old decaying buildings, some barely standing, others completely collapsed. The air was thick with the smell of rot and mildew. It was like stepping into a forgotten past. "This place gives me the creeps," Tori muttered. "Yeah, no kidding," I replied. "Let's just find someone and get the hell out of here." We parked the car and got out, the gravel crunching under our feet. The town was eerily silent, the only sound the faint whisper of wind through the trees. We walked toward what looked like the main street, our eyes scanning for any sign of life. And then we saw them. A group of figures emerged from one of the buildings. At first I thought they were just locals, but as they got closer, it became clear something was very wrong. They were dressed in ragged clothes, their faces dirty and gaunt. There was a wildness in their eyes that sent a chill down my spine. One of them called out, his voice raspy and guttural. "We're lost," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We were hoping to get some directions." The man grinned, revealing teeth that were yellowed and broken. "Well, you've come to the right place." Before we could react, more figures appeared from the shadows surrounding us. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. We were trapped. "Let's get out of here," Wes whispered, and we started to back away, but they closed in quickly. Now," the man said, his grin widening. "No need to rush. We've got plenty of time to get to know each other." We turned and bolted for the car, but they were on us in an instant. One of them grabbed Tori, dragging her to the ground. Wes and Marco tried to fight them off, but there were too many. I reached for Tori, but someone tackled me from behind, sending me sprawling. Chaos erupted. Wes managed to break free and sprinted towards the car, but one of the men threw a rock, hitting him in the back of the head. Wes fell, motionless. Marco was faring no better, pinned down by two of the men struggling desperately. They dragged us back into the town, our resistance futile. Tori was screaming, tears streaming down her face. They forced us into one of the decrepit buildings, the interior as rotten and decayed as the rest of the town. We were thrown into a dark, dank room, the door slamming shut behind us. The reality of our situation was sinking in. We were prisoners in a place that time had forgotten, at the mercy of people who seemed more like feral animals than humans. The air was thick with a stench of decay and something else, something metallic and sharp. Wes groaned, blood trickling down the side of his face. "They're gonna kill us, aren't they?" Tori's voice was a whisper filled with terror. "No," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. "We'll find a way." Hours passed, each one dragging on longer than the last. Occasionally we heard footsteps outside, the sound of low voices, but no one came in. We were left to rot in the darkness, fear gnawing at our sanity. At some point, Marco stood up, his expression hardening. "I'm not waiting around to die. We need to find a way out." He started to examine the room, looking for any possible escape. The walls were crumbling, the wood rotting, but there were no windows and the door was solid. I joined him, desperate for any hope. "Look here," Marco whispered, pointing to a section of the wall where the wood was particularly decayed. "If we can break through this, we might be able to get out." We worked silently, prying at the wood with our fingers, using anything we could find to dig into the rotten wall. The progress was slow, but it was something. Hours felt like days as we chipped away, our fingers bleeding and raw. Finally, we managed to create a hole big enough to squeeze through. Marco went first, peering through the gap to make sure the coast was clear. He nodded and we followed, one by one, emerging into the cold night air. The town was still eerily quiet, but we didn't waste any time. We stuck to the shadows, moving as silently as we could, hearts pounding in our chests. Our goal was simple: get to the car and get the hell out of there. We made it to the edge of the town without incident, but just as we were about to reach the car, a shout rang out. They had spotted us. Panic surged through me, and we sprinted the last few yards, throwing ourselves into the car. "Go, go, go!" I shouted at Wes, who fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. The engine roared to life, and we tore out of there, the figures chasing after us, their shouts growing fainter as we sped down the gravel road. None of us spoke as we drove, the horror of what we had just escaped sinking in. We drove for hours until we finally reached a small town with a police station. We stumbled in, disheveled and traumatized, barely coherent as we tried to explain what had happened. The officers were skeptical at first, but when we led them back to Hollisville, the truth was undeniable. The buildings were there, just as we described, but they were empty. The people who had captured us were gone, vanished into the woods. But there was evidence: bloodstains, discarded clothes, and bones scattered around. Grim proof of the nightmare we had lived through. It took weeks for the reality of it all to sink in, and we were never the same. We had escaped with our lives, but Hollisville had left its mark on us. We never spoke of it again, each of us dealing with the memories in our own way. As we stood there, watching the officers comb through the ruins of the town, I felt a strange mix of relief and horror. We had survived, but the shadows of that place would haunt us forever. And that was that. The investigation that followed our escape revealed disturbing details about Hollisville's history. The town had been officially abandoned in the 1950s after the local mining industry collapsed, but rumors persisted about strange occurrences in the area. Local hunters reported avoiding the region, claiming it felt wrong. There were stories of missing hikers and campers dating back decades. The police investigation uncovered a network of tunnels beneath the town, presumably from the old mining operations. What they found there made even hardened officers pale. The tunnels had been lived in recently. They found makeshift living quarters, storage areas filled with stolen goods, and worse, evidence of other victims who hadn't been as fortunate as us. Forensics teams spent weeks documenting everything. They found personal effects belonging to missing persons from several surrounding states. The oldest dated back to the 1970s. The people who had captured us weren't just deranged squatters. They were part of something much darker, a legacy of violence that had been hidden in these woods for generations. The physical wounds healed quickly enough. The cut on Wes's head needed 12 stitches but left only a small scar. My ribs were bruised from the tackle, and Marco's shoulder was sprained from the struggle. Tori had a nasty gash on her leg that required some minor surgery. But the psychological scars ran deeper. Nightmares became a regular occurrence. In mine, I was always back in that dark room, the sound of footsteps approaching, knowing what waited on the other side of the door. Wes couldn't sleep without lights on anymore. Marco threw himself into work, taking extra shifts at the hospital where he worked as a nurse, anything to keep his mind occupied. Tori moved away, saying she needed a fresh start somewhere far from woods and mountains. The media caught wind of the story eventually. They called it the Hollisville Horror, running sensational pieces about cannibalistic mountain folk and lost towns. None of them got it right. They couldn't capture the reality of what we'd experienced. The absolute terror of being trapped in that room. The crushing certainty that we were going to die there. I found myself obsessing over the town's history, spending hours researching in libraries and online archives. I learned that Hollisville had once been a prosperous mining community, home to over 500 people. The mine produced silver and zinc, enough to keep the town wealthy through the early 1900s. But there were always dark rumors. Local newspapers from the period reported occasional disappearances, usually dismissed as mining accidents or people moving away without notice. But reading between the lines, a pattern emerged. Every few years, people would vanish, usually outsiders, travelers passing through. The town's isolation made investigation difficult, and most cases were eventually forgotten. When the mine closed in 1947, most of the population left within months. Those who remained were mostly the old families, people whose roots in the valley went back generations. By 1952, the town was officially abandoned. But maybe not everyone left. Maybe something remained, something that had been there all along, hiding in the shadows of this seemingly normal mining town. The police never found our captors. They organized sweeps of the surrounding forest, brought in tracking dogs, even used thermal imaging from helicopters. But the woods around Hollisville were vast and dense, filled with caves and old mine shafts, perfect hiding places for those who knew the terrain. 6 months after our escape, I received a letter. No return address, just my name written in shaky handwriting. Inside was a single piece of paper with 3 words: "We're still here." I turned it over to the police, who added it to their file, but we all knew the truth. They were out there, watching, waiting. Maybe they'd found another abandoned town, another dark corner of the world to call their own. The experience changed how I saw the world. I became acutely aware of the thin veneer of civilization that covers our society, how quickly it can be stripped away. The people in Hollisville weren't monsters from some horror movie. They were humans who had chosen to embrace something darker, something primitive that lurks in all of us. A year after our escape, I returned to Hollisville one last time. The police had finished their investigation, and the town was scheduled for demolition. The county had decided it was safer to raze what remained than risk anyone else stumbling upon it. I stood at the edge of town, watching as the sun set behind the mountains. The buildings looked smaller somehow, less menacing in the fading light. But the feeling of wrongness remained, a heaviness in the air that made it hard to breathe. As darkness fell, I heard something, a distant sound that might have been the wind through the trees, or might have been laughter echoing from the shadows. I didn't stay to find out. Some questions are better left unanswered, some places better left forgotten. The demolition crew came the next week, reducing the remaining buildings to rubble. They filled in the mine entrances with concrete and posted warning signs throughout the area. But you can't erase history so easily. Sometimes, on cold nights when the wind blows just right, I think about Hollisville. I think about the people who lived there, both before and after its abandonment. I think about the secrets still buried in those woods, the stories that will never be told. And I wonder if somewhere, in another forgotten corner of the world, something similar is happening right now. The 4 of us still keep in touch, bound together by our shared trauma. We meet once a year for dinner, though we never talk about what happened. We don't need to. It's there in the way we all check the exits when we enter a room, in how we tense up at unexpected sounds, in the haunted look that sometimes crosses our faces when we think no one's watching. Last month, I read about a family that went missing in the Adirondacks. Their car was found on a remote forest road, their campsite undisturbed. The article mentioned that they had veered off their planned route, taking an unmarked road in search of a scenic viewpoint. I called the investigating officer and told him our story. He listened patiently, but I could hear the skepticism in his voice. Just another missing persons case, he assured me. They'd probably got lost in the woods. Maybe he was right. Maybe I'm seeing connections that aren't there, finding patterns in random events. But I know what's out there. I've seen the darkness that hides in forgotten places, in the spaces between civilized worlds, and I know that somewhere right now, someone else is taking a wrong turn, following a road that isn't on any map, about to discover that some towns are better left lost. The world feels different now, smaller somehow, yet filled with more shadows than before. I've started locking my doors at night, something I never used to do. I've installed security cameras around my house and keep a loaded gun in my bedside drawer. Paranoid? Perhaps. But I've learned that the real horrors in this world aren't the monsters from movies or books. They're the ones that wear human faces, that live in the dark spaces we pretend don't exist. I still go camping occasionally, still enjoy the outdoors, but I stick to marked trails now, well-traveled paths where other hikers are always within earshot. I don't take shortcuts or explore unmarked roads. Some might say the experience broke something in me, made me fearful. I prefer to think it made me wiser. There are places in this world that don't want to be found, secrets that should remain buried. The official report on Hollisville remains inconclusive. The FBI got involved eventually, adding the case to their database of unsolved crimes. They interviewed us multiple times, trying to piece together what had happened. But without bodies, without suspects, there wasn't much they could do. The case is still open, gathering dust in some filing cabinet. Sometimes I dream about that hole we dug in the wall, about crawling through it into the night. In my dreams, I'm always alone, and what waits on the other side isn't freedom but something worse. A darkness so complete it has substance, a void that reaches out with hungry hands. I wake from these dreams drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the taste of rot and decay in my mouth. But we survived. That's what I tell myself on the bad days, when the memories threaten to overwhelm me. We got out. We're still here. The town is gone now, buried under rubble and concrete, its secrets sealed away. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder if we really escaped at all, or if part of us is still there, trapped in that dark room, waiting for footsteps that never stop coming.